This was the story of the greatest king on the continent of Ares, a ruler surrounded by what could only be described as psychopaths. He remained undefeated until the moment of his death, and the people of the land came to call him the Mad King Mars. According to legend, the final words he left behind before his demise were simple and blunt, stating that he did not want to eat something that disgusting. That was where the story began. An attendant approached and brought food near him. Mars showed no interest in it. He stated that he had no appetite at the moment and allowed the attendant to leave. His name was Mars, the prince of a small kingdom located in a remote corner of the continent of Ares. As a prince, it would normally be assumed that he had access to luxurious and delicious meals. Anyone hearing his title would naturally imagine such comfort. The reality, however, was far different. At that very moment, Mars was eating monster meat simply to stay alive. In order to survive, he had been forced to escape the castle and hunt monsters in the forest, relying on their meat as his only safe source of food. This situation was not caused by a lack of food in the castle. There had always been more than enough meals prepared for him, as expected for a prince. The problem was that most of those meals were laced with poison. His kingdom was overflowing with corruption, and the prime minister, Gamras, ruled like a tyrant behind the scenes. For reasons that were never made clear, Gamras viewed Mars as an obstacle that needed to be removed and continued searching for ways to assassinate him. Even after cooking the monster meat, the taste remained awful. It was harsh and unpleasant, but eating it was necessary if he wanted to keep living. A quiet thought lingered in his mind as he endured another bite, wondering how long he would be forced to continue living this way. Just before he could take the next bite, a mysterious girl suddenly appeared behind him. Her presence was so sudden that it felt as if she had emerged from nowhere. She addressed him directly and expressed her intention of making him her pupil. Mars immediately stepped back and drew his sword. The sudden appearance troubled him, as he had not sensed her presence at all. The girl calmly observed him and remarked that he still had much to learn. At the same time, she pointed out that Mars possessed clear potential. She then declared that he was worthy to inherit her blade. Mars questioned the reasoning behind such a claim, unable to understand how she could arrive at that conclusion. The girl responded with a brief smile. In her view, the answer was simple. She believed he was worthy because he had been eating monster meat. Mars reacted with mild confusion at the explanation, struggling to process what he had just heard. The girl explained that by eating monster meat, a human could slowly absorb the strength of the monsters, though the process happened very slowly. She also pointed out that monster meat tasted terrible and was poisonous at the same time. Because of that, it was natural that ordinary people would never consider eating it. While listening to her explanation, Mars found himself wondering who this person was and what she was suddenly talking about. Mars explained that during the first few times he had eaten monster meat, he had thrown up. However, it was still less poisonous than the meals that had killed the poison tester assigned to taste his food. The girl reacted with confusion at the mention of the poison tester being killed. Although it was a matter that should have remained within the kingdom, Mars ended up explaining everything to her. He revealed that he was a prince. He spoke about how his mother had died and how his father, despite being the king, had never protected him. Because of the struggle for the throne, Mars had become a prime target for assassination, and nearly every meal served to him in the castle had begun to contain poison. The girl asked whether Mars had started eating monster meat because he was trying to escape the poisoned food prepared in the castle. She also pointed out that the monster meat itself was poisonous. Mars responded that it was not that bad. Once he had grown used to it, it would not kill him, though the taste was still terrible. In Mars's thoughts, the girl simply ignored his situation and did not show any sympathy toward him. Her attitude felt somewhat rude, yet in a strange way it helped him. The girl then remarked that the fact he had managed to get used to it made him quite remarkable. After that, she added that if he was still afraid of poison, he still had a long way to go. With that, the girl suddenly tossed something toward Mars. Mars asked what the object was. To him, it looked somewhat ominous, though he still expressed his thanks. Mars pointed out that she was giving something like that to someone she had only just met, and he wondered why she would go that far. He then asked who she actually was. The girl answered and introduced herself as Cassandra. Mars repeated the name Cassandra, and his eyes widened slightly as realization reached him. He clarified whether she was that Cassandra, the one known as the Red Demon Sword Cassandra. Cassandra acknowledged that people did call her by that name, though she did not particularly like being referred to as the Red Demon. The Red Demon, also known as the Beast, was a battle-crazed warrior. She was widely known as a famous sword saint, a fighter who had defeated dragons and even evil gods. Mars formed a small smile as the thought crossed his mind that receiving a ring from someone like her must mean it was a powerful magic item. In his thoughts, he also considered that if Cassandra truly accepted him as her pupil, he would no longer have to worry about assassination attempts. With that expectation, he placed the ring on his finger. The moment he finished wearing it, Cassandra revealed that the ring was actually a cursed item that afflicted its user with poison. his mood immediately shifted after hearing that. Cassandra explained that this was the first test given by a master to her pupil. She expected him to prove that he could overcome the poison contained in the ring. Soon after, a sudden sensation tightened around his throat. Mars began to wonder what was happening as the feeling quickly worsened, and the thought that he might die crossed his mind. Cassandra calmly walked toward him and remarked that relying on items to deal with simple poison was pathetic. She wanted him to prove that he could conquer the poison from the ring. She explained that poison resistance could be learned by defeating poison itself. She also added that Mars would not be able to remove the ring unless he conquered the poison or died because of it. According to her, an ordinary person would die very quickly, but someone who regularly ate monster meat might be able to resist it. Mars quickly realized that Cassandra was dangerous. That became his first clear impression of her as his master. She had made him wear a poisonous object while he had been trying to avoid poison all along. The situation felt almost like a cruel joke. At the same time, inside the castle, an elderly man examined Mars and stated that the poison could not be healed. Even cure magic had no effect on it. Mars remained half dead for 3 days and 3 nights. Every doctor who tried to treat him eventually gave up on curing the poison. The situation grew so serious that rumors began spreading through the castle that Mars had finally succumbed to poison. In the end, however, Mars somehow managed to survive. After his recovery, people around him offered congratulations for overcoming the poison. Strangely, no one seemed to find it unusual that he had been poisoned in the first place. Mars's father reminded him that protecting himself was his own responsibility. In Mars's thoughts, that was hardly something someone would normally say to a person who had just recovered. At the same time, he admitted to himself that this time the poisoning had been entirely his own fault. Once he had recovered, Mars tasted the food that was served to him. He was certain that it contained poison, yet nothing happened after he ate it. He paused, surprised by the result. It seemed as if the effect of the poison had changed. Mars realized that he did not feel sick at all. At that moment, he understood that he had successfully conquered the poison. Mars had returned to eating normal food. He understood that it had not been easy, but the resistance he had gained against poison helped him greatly. One night, he went into the forest and informed Cassandra, his master, that he had successfully conquered the poison. Cassandra showed no surprise and made it clear that she had already expected him to accomplish it. With that achievement, there was no longer any need for him to worry about deadly poison. Mars felt sincere gratitude toward her. Soon after, Cassandra placed something on the ground and stated that she intended to give it to him. The items were bracelets infused with gravity magic. Once worn, they would double the weight of the person using them. At that moment, Mars began to think that Cassandra might actually be trying to kill him, since the previous trial had clearly not been the end of his training. Cassandra then asked whether he was still eating monster meat. Mars admitted that he had not done so for about a week. He explained that now that he no longer had to worry about poison, he no longer had any reason to keep eating it. He also wondered whether stopping had been a bad decision. Without answering directly, Cassandra walked away and instructed him to wait where he was. When she returned, she brought back the body of a dead monster. She tossed a piece of the monster's meat toward Mars and told him to eat it. The creature was a great basilisk. Cassandra explained that if Mars had truly conquered the poison from the ring, then he should also be able to eat that meat. She pointed out that the monster was extremely rare, though the meat was completely raw. Mars wondered if it would be possible to cook it first. Cassandra refused the idea, explaining that cooking it would make the meat less effective. Mars reluctantly began to eat the meat. The taste nearly made him throw up, and the thought crossed his mind that this might finally be the thing that killed him. Cassandra urged him to swallow it. After forcing it down, Mars dropped to his knees and struggled to stay upright. He asked whether the meat itself was poisonous. Cassandra confirmed that it was. She explained that the stronger the monster, the more poisonous its meat became to humans. As an example, she mentioned that the meat of a dragon would be extremely poisonous. In comparison, she believed that the great basilisk meat was probably the strongest Mars could handle at that moment. According to her, even a single lick of it would be enough to kill 500 adults. Mars came to the realization that Cassandra was completely insane, though he managed to push that thought aside. He assumed that the situation would end there for the day. However, Cassandra ordered him to finish all of the meat. Mars felt that the amount was far too much for anyone to eat. Cassandra interpreted his hesitation as a sign of confidence and questioned whether he believed he had already become strong enough and no longer needed to eat monster meat. She then pushed him further, telling him to prove it by attacking her with the sword he was holding. Mars was surprised that Cassandra did not even bother to draw her own sword. The thought crossed his mind that she might be looking down on him. Even so, he rushed forward and launched an attack with all his strength. Cassandra simply responded with a kick. The force of it sent Mars flying away. She then calmly walked toward him and pointed out that he was still weak. In her view, he clearly needed to eat more monster meat. Without hesitation, She pressed the meat against his mouth and forced him to continue eating it. It took a long time, but Mars eventually managed to consume all of the meat, tears running down his face the entire time. From that moment onward, his training continued. Mars spent his days eating monster meat and learning swordsmanship from his master. Although they only met once each week, Cassandra paid very close attention to his progress and immediately noticed whether he was improving quickly enough. Whenever Mars tried to cheat by avoiding monster meat, Cassandra forced it down his throat. If Mars failed to take his sword training seriously, Cassandra beat him severely. Eventually, his training shifted toward fighting monsters directly while continuing to eat them. Even so, Cassandra believed he should only fight weaker monsters on his own. Because of that, she carefully chose monsters that Mars could defeat only by a narrow margin. Among all the monsters he faced, however, Cassandra remained the strongest of them all. While Cassandra and Mars were practicing their sparring, Cassandra began to notice that Mars was steadily improving. She pushed him forward again and urged him to try killing her. Cassandra possessed a special skill in battle. She was able to hold back just enough to avoid killing Mars during their fights. Her movements were so fast that Mars's body often could not keep up with him. Yet after 3 years of relentless and brutal training, things began to change. Cassandra observed that Mars was finally starting to get the hang of it. During that time, Mars learned how to detect the presence of others and avoid incoming attacks. His survival instincts had sharpened, driven by the simple desire not to be struck by Cassandra's attacks. Looking back, the 3 years Mars spent training under his master felt like pure torture. Compared to fighting Cassandra or battling powerful monsters, dealing with the assassins inside the castle felt almost like child's play. Then one day, Cassandra allowed Mars to face a massive wyvern that descended from the sky. The creature soared high above before diving down toward him. In a sudden moment, Mars struck and cut the wyvern into pieces. Cassandra felt satisfied seeing that Mars had truly taken down a wyvern. Even though it was not as strong as a dragon, it was still a formidable monster. She acknowledged that Mars had done well and had grown quite strong. Cassandra also noticed that Mars seemed to have become accustomed to eating monster meat. Mars confirmed that he had been eating it every day. Cassandra pointed out that growing stronger in such a way was a good thing, and Mars agreed with that. Cassandra then smiled and told him that there was nothing left for her to teach him. She reminded him to continue his training and warned that the next time they met, she would truly kill him if she discovered that he had been neglecting it. After leaving those words behind, the master who had trained him for 3 years simply walked away. Only afterward did Mars realize that he had never asked where she lived. It seemed likely that she spent her time traveling across the world, constantly searching for powerful enemies to fight. Because of that, it was probably rare for someone like her to remain in a single kingdom for 3 full years. Mars also understood that if he ever stopped training, Cassandra would truly come back to kill him. He felt grateful for the harsh training he had endured. It had made him far stronger, yet he knew that he still needed to become even stronger if he wanted to survive. The fragile path he had chosen in order to escape the assassins had ultimately led him straight into something that felt like the depths of hell. At that time, Mars had no idea how much his meeting with Cassandra would change his life. Still, if he wanted to survive the assassins sent by Gamaras, face powerful monsters, and above all avoid being killed by his own master, Mars had no choice but to keep eating monster meat. Quick pause. If you're enjoying this, help us reach 1,000 subscribers. 1 click equals instant power-up. Subscribe now. Back to the story. Some time had passed since Cassandra disappeared. During that period, Mars was attacked by yet another assassin. He killed the attacker, making it the 10th assassin he had eliminated that month. The number even made Mars wonder whether the assassin industry might eventually face a shortage of workers. Even so, Gamaras continued aiming for his life as always. Gamaras had forced Mars's father into a marriage arrangement with his own daughter, part of a plan meant to produce a son. That child would gain the right to inherit the throne, which meant Mars had to be removed from the line of succession. However, the red demon Cassandra had somehow become Mars's mentor. Even so, her method of training often felt as if she was trying to kill him herself. Mars remembered her warning clearly, that he had to keep eating monster meat, and that if she ever found him being lazy the next time they met, she would kill him. Because of that, Mars had no choice but to grow stronger if he wanted to stay alive. At times he wondered how his life had ended up like this. Nearby, Mars noticed several men sparring, one fighter facing 4 opponents at once. As he watched them, a thought crossed his mind. It had been more than 200 years since the last war, and because of that long period of peace, practical combat training had nearly disappeared. The kingdom of Fallon was currently at the peak of its peaceful era. Skill with a sword was often considered unnecessary and was sometimes viewed as something only barbarians cared about. Even duels involving swords were prohibited. Because of that, swordmasters who continued to train seriously were often seen as strange or unstable people. In some cases, it was even considered a matter that should be punished by imprisonment. Mars approached the men and asked if he could join them. One of the men demanded to know who he was. Another looked at him and assumed he must be some noble's child. One of them warned him to leave if he did not want to get killed, while another suspected that Mars was mocking them and only wanted to play around for his own amusement. Mars quietly realized that these men clearly disliked nobles. Among them, however, one man seemed to understand the situation better than the others and allowed Mars to train with them. The man warned him not to complain if he ended up dying. With that, the man named Agma charged toward Mars. In the next moment, Agma was thrown away by a single strike from Mars. Mars remarked that Agma was still alive, noting to himself that most assassins would normally be cut in half by a blow like that. Immediately afterward, all of the men attacked Mars at the same time. A few moments later, the men were kneeling in a line. Mars informed them that from that point on, they would serve as his training partners once every 7 days. He also pointed out that they had already seen that he was stronger than all 5 of them combined. One of the men suddenly shouted in refusal. In his view, Mars only wanted to follow them around for entertainment. The man spoke angrily about how they already struggled just to secure enough food each day. That was not something a noble like Mars would understand, since nobles were used to eating good meals every day. The man demanded to know what Mars planned to eat that night. Mars answered that his meal would be red bone meat. The man reacted with confusion, but Mr. Agma quickly pointed out that red bone meat was the flesh of a monster. He also noted that a red bone was not a monster that someone like Mars could defeat alone. Another man insisted that Mars had to be lying. Someone else added that everyone knew monster meat was poisonous. Mars regarded the accusation of lying as ignorance. He then pointed out that something was approaching behind them. A massive blood bear appeared. The men immediately panicked and shouted in fear. Mars looked at the creature and quietly wondered whether it would make a decent meal for the next day. In the next moment, he cut off the monster's head. Mr. Agma was stunned by what he had just witnessed. Mars then showed them that he was actually eating the meat and encouraged Mr. Agma to try some as well. Mr. Agma took a small piece while Mars advised him to take only a small bite, warning that eating too much at once would probably kill him. Mr. Agma carefully took a bite. The taste nearly made him throw up, since he was not used to eating monster meat. Mr. Agma had been born the 3rd son of a noble family that valued proper manners far more than skill with a sword. He had always disliked that expectation. In his mind, swords existed to make their wielders stronger. Many people viewed him as a disgrace to the nobility, while others simply saw him as a fool wasting his efforts. To avoid falling into frustration, he had hidden his true identity and gathered several companions to form a group. He called the group 100, an organization devoted entirely to the pursuit of strength. Within the group known as 100, power meant everything. The hierarchy of the organization was determined entirely by strength, which was why the title of 1 was given to the strongest member. At that time, the group already had more than 20 members, and they took pride in believing they were the strongest group in the country. Many of them even claimed they were far stronger than the kingdom's knights, whom they considered little more than decorations. However, someone seeking far greater power had now appeared before them. Mars encouraged Mr. Agma to continue eating monster meat. After Mr. Agma finished, Mars explained that blood bear meat was still too strong for him. According to Mars, he would first need to become accustomed to weaker monster meat, such as that from a killer rabbit. Mr. Agma reflected on the situation. In the end, everything they had claimed about themselves seemed like a lie. They believed they possessed power and determination, calling themselves seekers of strength, yet their confidence now felt hollow. With that realization, he bowed toward Mars and recognized him as someone worthy of being called number 0, the one above the strongest. He expressed the group's willingness to accept Mars's guidance and asked him to join them and train them. Mars repeated the unfamiliar title in confusion, wondering about the meaning of number 0. Even so, Agma assigned him that title and suggested that his new name within the group should be Zeros. The name Mars stood out too much, so the new title suited the situation perfectly. Mars also concealed his appearance by wearing armor he had found in some ancient rooms. From that point forward, he began training with the members of the group. Because of this, he could finally fight with his full strength, and his ability to handle battles against multiple opponents improved greatly. Above all, no matter how many times Mars defeated the members of 100, they always stood up again and continued fighting him until they eventually collapsed from exhaustion. Not even the assassins who had been sent after him had ever shown such persistence. Although the situation felt somewhat strange, Mars found himself satisfied by their determination. In this way, a full year passed as they continued training together. The results were impressive, though the direction everything was taking felt unusual. By that point, every member of the group had begun eating monster meat as well. Those who could eat the meat of stronger monsters received the greatest praise, while those who could only handle weaker monster meat were often labeled as weaklings. Even so, Mars personally did not believe that a person's worth or greatness should be judged solely by that measure. As a prince, he had never received this level of recognition before, which left him with mixed feelings about the situation. Meanwhile, at the headquarters of the Black Knights of Falun, a knight named Commander Chrome raised a question. He had heard rumors about a group that spent its time constantly fighting while eating monster meat. One of the knights present confirmed that the information was correct. The group called itself 100, and according to the reports, some members of the Black Knights had also joined them. The response shocked Commander Chrome. Among ordinary civilians, however, many people believed the group was actually helping. Since the knights were already occupied dealing with the most powerful threats, the fact that this group hunted monsters was seen as useful. Commander Chrome remained suspicious. The act of eating monster meat and even drinking its blood made him consider the possibility that the group might be part of some dangerous cult. The matter became even more serious if members of his own subordinates were involved. That was something he could not ignore. Because of that, Commander Chrome decided to personally investigate the actions of the group known as 100. If the organization was attempting to bring chaos to the country, he intended for the Black Knights to deal with them directly. At the same time, somewhere within the forest, one of the members of 100 was preparing to teach a newcomer how to hunt monsters. He reminded the new members not to push themselves too far. The man with the mohawk hairstyle advised the newcomers to eat monster meat slowly and in small amounts. While secretly observing the scene, Commander Chrome realized that the situation looked very different from what he had imagined. He could not even tell who the individual members were, and he wondered why the organization allowed almost anyone to join. The man with the mohawk soon approached Chrome and commented on his sword skills. From his perspective, someone with that level of ability could immediately participate in the ranking battles within 100. He also explained that the group's most important rule was the consumption of monster meat. Even someone strong would be considered lacking in determination if they were unable to eat it. The man with the mohawk handed a piece of monster meat to Chrome and pressed him to eat it. He explained that the taste might be unpleasant, but once someone became used to it, the body would definitely grow stronger. Chrome wondered whether it was truly necessary to eat monster meat. Yet as he forced himself to take a bite, he reflected that it hardly mattered anymore since he had already come this far. The taste nearly made him throw up. The man with the mohawk burst into laughter and remarked that he had reacted the same way when he first tried it. At that moment, Chrome considered the possibility that the man might have recognized his true identity and could even be trying to poison him. In Chrome's mind, there was little doubt that a group willing to eat such things must surely be some kind of evil cult. He decided that he would simply wait until he gathered enough evidence, and once that happened he would personally subdue them all. Then a full year passed. Chrome's body had grown noticeably more muscular. He had come to realize that monster meat was truly remarkable. His body felt stronger and more energetic, and his overall strength had clearly increased. Within 100, the members hunted monsters every night. They consumed all of the meat they gathered, and afterward they engaged in serious duels with one another until someone collapsed. Chrome reflected on how he once questioned his own sanity during the early days. Yet the act of pursuing strength alone had become so powerful that it now felt almost pleasurable. His thoughts often turned to the man known as Zeros, the one who stood at the very top of 100. That man felt like an existence far beyond reach. Zeros possessed techniques such as the Sonic Blade and the Magic Barrier, legendary skills that were once said to have been used by the hero who founded the country. As if that were not enough, Zeros shared those skills freely with others. Chrome realized that Zeros never held back his guidance from anyone who sincerely sought greater power. The thought made Chrome wonder how someone like Zeros could possess such a noble spirit. Because of that, the idea of subjugating 100 now felt almost like an act of blasphemy. Within that place, Chrome felt that he had finally found the true reason to keep living. Meanwhile, back at the castle, Mars walked through the hallways while listening to the many rumors that had recently begun circulating about 100. Within the castle, some people described the group as nothing more than barbarians who spent their time hunting monsters. Among the common people, however, they were often seen as allies who helped eliminate dangerous monsters. The opinions of nobles and ordinary citizens seemed sharply divided. Compared to living as a prince whose life was constantly under threat, Mars honestly felt that spending time as Zeros within 100 was far more enjoyable. Inside the throne room, Mars was asked whether he knew about a group known as 100. Recently, rumors had spread about a strange and dangerous organization that fought among themselves and ate monster meat. Some people even described it as a mad cult. Mars responded that the description sounded questionable and wondered where such information had come from. The one speaking to him was Gamaras, the very man who had long been targeting Mars's life. Gamaras then stated that Mars would eventually become the next king. However, he also pointed out that Mars's record as a prince had been rather poor. Because of that, Gamaras presented a suggestion. He proposed that Mars should subjugate the group known as 100. If Mars managed to defeat them, there would be no doubt that he would be recognized as the rightful successor to the throne, both within the kingdom and beyond its borders. Gamaras also noted that Mars possessed excellent sword skills. From Gamera's perspective, there was no one more suitable than Mars to deal with those so-called bandits. In his thoughts, Mars immediately realized the deeper meaning behind the suggestion. 100 had been gaining the support of the common people, and if he were the one to subjugate them, that support would likely collapse. To Mars, it seemed obvious that Gamera's was planning this as a form of revenge. Even Mars's own father continued to follow Gamera's commands. Gamera's asked Mars whether he could carry out the task. Mars calmly stated that he understood the request and accepted it. After leaving the throne room and walking through the hallway, Mars began thinking about the situation. Gamera's clearly intended to force him into a dirty role that would cause him to lose his standing. Even though Mars recognized the trap, he had no intention of letting Gamera's take advantage of him. Still, he wondered how he could resolve the situation. Nearby, a girl sat quietly on a chair. Mars noticed her presence. She remarked that it had been a long time since she last saw him. Mars immediately wondered who she was and how she had entered the royal hall without permission. Her position made it seem as though she had been waiting to ambush him. For a moment, he even considered the possibility that she might be another assassin. However, her presence carried a far more distinguished aura than that of a typical assassin. The girl then offered him her power, asking whether he wished to borrow it given the position he was currently in. At that moment, she addressed him by the name Zeros. Mars froze in shock, unable to understand how she could possibly know his identity as Zeros. Still confused, Mars wondered how she could possibly know him. The girl calmly revealed that she had expected him to forget and reminded him that she was Frau, his fiancée. At that moment, Mars suddenly realized that he did, in fact, have a fiancée. He felt apologetic for not remembering sooner and began to question what she had meant when she addressed him as Zeros. It was true that Mars was the leader of 100 under the name Zeros, but he had always hidden the fact that he was the prince. Besides, many years had passed since he last saw Frau. From his perspective, there should have been no way for her to know anything about what had happened during that time. Frau confidently revealed that she had been watching him all along through a crest. Through that mark, she was able to share his vision and even teleport directly to his location whenever she wished. Mars stared at the mark on his wrist in disbelief. Thinking back, he remembered that when they were children, Frau had once cast a strange spell on him. At the time it had looked like a simple birthmark. Because it appeared harmless and even somewhat interesting, he had ignored it completely. Only now did he realize that she had been observing him for years through that mark. The realization made him understand that she was far more dangerous than he had thought. Frau had first met Prince Mars when she was 8 years old. Her father had introduced them to each other as future fiancés. Even though Mars had been a prince, aside from his expensive clothing, he seemed like a very ordinary boy. At the time, Frau had not found him particularly interesting. During that period, she had just learned a new spell known as the Pact Mark. Since she needed a subject to test it on, she chose Mars without hesitation. The spell succeeded, and with that result, Frau felt satisfied. Sometime later, when Mars was 11 years old, he nearly died from poison. Frau found the poison itself interesting, which led her to use the Pact Mark again after a long period of ignoring it. After that moment, Prince Mars began behaving in unusual ways, including the decision to start eating monster meat. That unexpected development made things more interesting for her. Because of that, she began using the Pact Mark more frequently to watch him. While observing him during that time, she noticed that the prince's magical power was steadily increasing. That discovery led her to imitate his example and begin eating monster meat herself. Since that moment, Frau had never grown bored of watching Prince Mars. Mars realized that a serious problem had now appeared. His private life had been constantly watched by Frau all this time. For the moment, however, he chose to set that issue aside. Instead, he focused on asking Frau what she had meant earlier about lending him her power. Frau simply indicated that the matter could be discussed later. Meanwhile, at the base of 100, both Chrome and Warren were present. It was still difficult to believe that the two leaders of the 4 Knight Orders, representing the Red Knights and the Black Knights, had actually joined 100. Within the kingdom of Falun, there were 4 Knight Orders. The White Knights were responsible for protecting the king and the most powerful nobles. The Blue Knights handled the security of the royal capital. Meanwhile, the Red Knights and the Black Knights were assigned to lead expeditions and suppress monsters during times of war. Even with these powerful figures present, Zeros sensed that the atmosphere within 100 had become unusually heavy. Agma approached Zeros and asked him to listen carefully. According to the information he had gathered, the country was preparing to destroy 100. The commanders assigned to carry out this mission were Chrome of the Black Knights and Warren of the Red Knights. Zeros realized how quickly the information had spread. After hearing it, he concluded that the best option would be for 100 to leave the country. However, Warren addressed everyone gathered there and made his position clear. Both he and Chrome, along with the Red Knight Order and the Black Knight Order, had decided that they would support 100 until the very end. Whatever decision Zeros made, they would follow it. Zeros struggled to understand what Warren meant by supporting them until the end. Chrome then explained that he no longer believed there was any justice left within the corrupted country. If the Red Knights and the Black Knights joined forces with 100, their combined strength would become overwhelming. As long as Zeros continued to lead them, Chrome believed they had a real chance of winning a rebellion. Zeros quickly understood that they had no intention of fleeing. Instead, they were talking about betraying their own country and starting a civil war. In truth, Zeros had no desire to become involved in something as dangerous as a rebellion. He would rather leave the country entirely and live freely somewhere else. Zeros believed that once they saw his real identity, they would understand his position. With that thought, he removed his disguise and revealed his true face. Everyone present was shocked. The man they had followed as Zeros, the leader of 100, was none other than Prince Mars. Mars formed a small smile, believing that now everyone would understand the situation. As the Prince of Falun, he could not possibly lead a rebellion against his own country. Chrome quickly came to his own conclusion about what Zeros had meant. From his perspective, he had clearly understood the thoughts Mars was trying to convey. In Chrome's interpretation, Prince Mars did not intend to lead a rebellion but rather a legitimate war. To him, that meant the conflict would not be a rebellion at all. With great enthusiasm, Chrome declared that it would be a rightful battle to establish Prince Mars as the true successor to the throne. In his mind, justice was already on their side. Meanwhile, Mars quietly reflected that whether he was a prince or not, starting a rebellion against the country was not something he believed to be right. One of the other members suddenly shouted in admiration, convinced that Prince Mars had been preparing for this moment for many years. From that person's perspective, the reason Mars had gathered and strengthened 100 was to reach this very point. Mars could only think to himself that he had never gathered forces for the sake of a rebellion. In fact, he had originally brought in only a few people. Now the group had grown to more than 1,000 members, even though it was still called 100. He realized that he needed to calm everyone down first and make them understand the real situation. Mars pointed out that even if they had gathered an army, the royal castle itself was nearly impossible to breach. He wondered whether they truly believed they had any chance of defeating the kingdom. At that moment, approaching footsteps interrupted the tense atmosphere. The newcomer explained that the royal forces were not limited to the White Knights and the Blue Knights. There was also the Magic Division. Regarding the Magic Division, Frau declared that they would stand on Prince Mars's side. Mars was surprised by her sudden appearance. Chrome laughed lightly and reassured Mars that there was no need for him to test their resolve. According to Chrome, Miss Frau had already explained everything to them beforehand. Some members of 100 might not yet know this, but she was widely known by the title Frau the Empress of Thunder. She served as the main force of the kingdom's magic corps and was considered a crucial element in the nation's defense. Frau calmly stated that she would take responsibility for leading the Magic Division. Hearing that, the men erupted in excitement, convinced that victory was now guaranteed. Mars felt confused. In his thoughts, he remembered that Frau had mentioned lending him her strength, but he had not expected things to go this far. It now seemed as if they had been planning to fight from the beginning instead of escaping. He could hardly believe how the situation had unfolded. The entire story was now moving toward a rebellion against his own country. Mars questioned why Frau was helping them so much. Even though their engagement had been arranged by their parents, he wondered whether it was truly worth taking such a dangerous risk for something like that. Frau explained that her actions up until now had not been worthy of someone in her position as his fiancé. Because of that, she intended to act as a proper fiancé from that point forward. The reason she had managed to increase her magical power to the level that earned her the title Empress of Thunder was because she had followed Mars's example and begun eating monster meat. At first, she had not shown much interest in Mars at all. Now, however, she found herself unable to imagine breaking their engagement. A person whose life constantly hovered near death had become something she found deeply fascinating. Frau expressed that she wanted to continue watching over him and that she was glad he was her fiancé. At that moment, one of the members shouted with excitement, convinced that their victory was already guaranteed. They now had the commander of the Black Knights, Chrome, the commander of the Red Knights, Warren, and Frau, the Empress of Thunder. Alongside them were Agma and the entire force of 100, all led by Zeros, whose true identity was Prince Mars. Together, they believed they were ready to remove every corrupt noble in the country. Mars felt powerless to stop the momentum that had built around him. In his mind, this had become a group that could not easily be broken apart. Everyone appeared fully prepared to launch a rebellion against the kingdom. Their chances of victory were certainly high. Even so, Mars could not help but question the direction everything was taking. The situation seemed to be moving toward a path where he would have to fight. He also found himself wondering when exactly he had ever developed any interest in claiming the throne. Chrome declared that they were ready to sacrifice their lives for him. In their eyes, Prince Mars was the rightful heir to the kingdom of Falun. Around them, other members shouted in the name of justice, determined to ensure that their rebellion would succeed. Mars reflected on the moment when he had first been ordered to destroy 100. At that time, he had only two choices before him, to flee or to rebel. Now there was no turning back. He had never intended to begin a rebellion, and he had never desired the throne. His only wish had been to survive. For so long he had lived without allies, facing everything alone. Now people stood beside him. Their trust weighed heavily on him, so much that he found himself unable to reject it. Frau watched him closely. She understood that Mars had now become a threat to the kingdom, yet for reasons she could not fully explain, she found herself unable to look away from him. She expressed her determination to ensure that the rebellion would succeed and her intention to fight alongside him. Eventually, the day arrived when 100 would challenge the kingdom. A knight standing behind Mars noticed the tension in his posture and commented on it. The knight wondered if Mars felt nervous, considering that it was his first time facing such a situation. The knight reassured him that the battle itself could be left to the commanders of the Black Knights and the Red Knights. According to him, Mars's noble duty was simply to defeat Zeros, the leader of 100. If he failed to do so, the consequences would be severe. The White Knights were largely made up of the children of powerful nobles, many of whom were closely tied to Gamrus. Rather than protecting Mars, they were more likely to betray him. By forcing him into a direct confrontation with Zeros, they hoped he would fall. Soon, Chrome and Warren approached and asked Prince Mars whether they were ready to advance. Chrome requested a brief moment of Mars's time before the battle began. However, the commander of the White Knights immediately intervened, insisting that they wait. From his perspective, the prince should not be addressed directly. There was also no need for the prince to personally involve himself with a group like 100. At that moment, the White Knight commander was caught off guard. The Black Knights and the Red Knights had arrived in full force. To him, the members of 100 were nothing more than commoners pretending to be knights. Treating them as equals felt disgraceful, as if the honor of their order had fallen into shame. Meanwhile, Mars noticed the eagerness in Chrome and Warren. Seeing their determination, he realized that he had no choice but to strengthen his own resolve. Mars then addressed all of the troops gathered before him and declared that their true enemies were inside the capital. The White Knight commander was stunned by the statement and struggled to understand what Mars meant. From his perspective, the enemy was supposed to be 100. Before any further reaction could follow, Mars moved his sword. In a single motion, he struck the man's head. The members of 100 watched in astonishment at what they had just witnessed. The strike was executed with remarkable precision, a clean and flawless cut delivered with masterful skill. Afterward, Mars turned his attention to another White Knight. He pointed out that regardless of how the battle ended, the White Knights had intended to kill him anyway. The knight reacted with visible shock upon realizing that Mars had discovered the truth. To Mars, however, the situation had been obvious. At that moment, Chrome stepped forward and cut off the man's head as well, remarking that the outcome no longer surprised him. Another White Knight quickly begged for his life, insisting that he had never intended to assassinate Mars. He claimed that the decision had not been his own and that he had simply been following orders from the deputy commander. Chrome looked down on him with clear disdain. A knight who behaved in such a cowardly manner, in his view, could never protect the kingdom. As long as men like that remained alive, there would never be real peace. With that judgment, Chrome cut off his head. Soon after, the remaining White Knights were also slain. Chrome remarked that the White Knights had completely tarnished their honor. Then he urged Mars to move forward, declaring that it was time to bring true justice to the corrupted kingdom. Mars quietly reflected that Chrome's loyalty felt deeply sincere, though the intensity in his gaze was somewhat overwhelming. Warren then pointed out that they were likely being watched. Mars already understood that. From that point onward, everything would depend on speed. Mars urged them to hurry toward the royal capital. At the city gate, one of the White Knights announced the arrival of the prince and ordered the gates to be sealed. Before the command could be carried out, Sir Bled of the Blue Knights struck the White Knight down and ordered the gates to be opened. The Blue Knights declared their loyalty to Prince Mars. Mars recognized Sir Bled and acknowledged his efforts. Sir Bled explained that the Blue Knights were responsible for maintaining order in the capital, and for that reason they had chosen to stand with their prince. As they entered the capital, the members of 100 had already begun clashing with the White Knights. During the battle, one of the White Knights recognized Agma. The knight mocked them and spoke as if he intended to demonstrate what true swordsmanship looked like. Agma responded with clear contempt toward that claim. From his perspective, the idea of calling that real swordsmanship was laughable. Instead, he declared that 100 would show them what true swordsmanship truly meant. As Agma struck down the White Knights before him, he made it clear that the battlefield was not a place for showing off. It was a place where survival decided everything. Agma reflected on what true strength really meant. In his view, real power was the ability to crush the enemy completely. Ideals and noble words would not protect anyone on the battlefield. Violence could not simply be stopped through brute force alone. One of the White Knights admitted that there was truth in those words. From his perspective, 100 were nothing more than thugs. Mars quietly thought that the statement was sadly accurate. The White Knight then pointed out that they still had the mage corps on their side. Once the mages joined the battle, the situation would become far more dangerous. Meanwhile, inside the mage tower, Frau's father summoned her and reported an urgent situation. News had reached him that Mars had begun a rebellion. In response, Frau made a request of her father. She asked him to step down from his position and pass the family title to her. Her father reacted with confusion. He tried to confirm whether she truly meant for him to give up his title. He also pointed out that he was not old enough to retire and that the position of head of the family was not something that could be given to a woman. Frau began preparing a spell. Her father questioned what she intended to do. At that moment, Frau released a powerful lightning spell that struck the other mages present. As she spoke, she described the sequence of attacks. First came the shock. Those who survived would then face lightning. Those who endured the lightning would be met with an explosion. Anyone who survived the explosion would then face dissolution. The mages immediately begged her to stop. Frau turned to her father once more and asked him again to surrender the family title to her. She pleaded with him to grant his daughter's request just this once. Outside, one of the members of 100 began to wonder what was happening. He questioned why the mage corps had not yet joined the battle and speculated about whether Frau might have done something. Soon after, Gamras appeared. He called out to Prince Mars and remarked on the unexpected situation, noting that he had never imagined Mars would end up leading a rebellion. Gamras then declared that Mars's path toward the throne would end at that moment. Speaking in his own name, he proclaimed that Mars's life was now forfeit. Immediately afterward, a group of fighters stepped forward and blocked Mars's path, preparing themselves to confront him. The group of adventurers stepped forward and declared that they had come to end Mars's life. Mars's father called out to him. As Mars looked at him, a quiet thought crossed his mind. His father had never once investigated the death of Mars's mother. It seemed likely that he simply did not care about the outcome of the conflict, as long as he himself remained safe. Suddenly, a mage cast a gravity spell on Mars. Even under the spell, Mars remained calm. Gamras confidently declared that Mars would no longer be able to move. According to him, Mars had already been restrained through the use of magic. Gamras admitted that the sudden rebellion had surprised him, but he had prepared for such a situation in advance. As part of that preparation, he had hired A-rank adventurers. Soon, reinforcements would arrive and completely surround Mars. At that point, everything would finally be over. However, Mars was still wearing the gravity bracelet that Cassandra had given him. Under the weight of the spell, he simply walked forward. One of the adventurers stared in disbelief, wondering how Mars had managed to escape. It appeared as if the gravity spell was not working. Mars calmly explained that the gravity spell was functioning perfectly. He had simply become accustomed to such pressure. Then, something exploded above them. One of the adventurers immediately recognized the attack as the ability of a poison lizard. He warned that Mars would soon become paralyzed. Mars recognized the creature as well. He casually remarked that its meat had tasted terrible. The adventurer was stunned by the statement and questioned whether Mars had actually eaten poison lizard meat, something that was essentially pure poison. Another adventurer rushed forward and attacked Mars, convinced that the claim had been a bluff. Mars responded with a single strike. The A-rank adventurers watched in shock as their companion was cut cleanly in half. One of them quickly asked the healer whether the fallen man could still be saved. The healer calmly responded that only a necromancer could possibly deal with something like that. Mars quietly apologized, explaining that it had been a long time since he had fought without wearing the bracelet, which caused him to lose control of his strength. Several members of the group immediately threw daggers toward him. One of them ordered Mika to prepare an attack spell, told Luida to support them, and instructed Chad to distract Mars. Mars remained completely unfazed. As another adventurer rushed toward him, Mars unleashed a sonic blade. The impact was overwhelming, and the attacker was cut in half as well. Another member shouted for the healer to help, but the healer responded that saving someone from such injuries would require the power of a saint. Anger spread among the remaining adventurers. One of them raised her power and unleashed blazing crimson flames toward Mars, declaring that the fire would fall upon its enemy and burn. Mars remained calm even then. He acknowledged that the attack was not something he could block directly. Just before the flames could strike him, a magic barrier suddenly formed and stopped the attack. The remaining members of the party stared in shock. The mage who had cast the flames fell to her knees in disbelief. That spell had been her strongest attack, yet it had been stopped by a magic barrier, an ability usually seen only in high-level monsters. Mars formed a small smile as he looked at the stunned expressions around him. Seeing their surprise felt strangely satisfying. He had mastered that ability after repeatedly facing demon apes. By eating their meat again and again, he had eventually perfected the skill. As he calmly walked forward, he asked the remaining members to move aside, making it clear that he had no intention of killing them. The party leader stepped forward and blocked his path. Mars advised him to run and promised to let him go if he did. The party leader reacted with anger, believing that Mars was mocking them. In his pride, the man declared that they would never simply walk away after their comrades had been killed. He reminded Mars that he was an A-rank adventurer. With that, the man swung his sword at him. Mars immediately blocked the strike. Their swords clashed several times in quick succession. During the exchange, Mars realized that the party leader was a skilled swordsman. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the man might even be able to keep up with him. Then Mars delivered a powerful kick. The force of the blow sent the party leader flying into a wall. The man stared in disbelief, struggling to accept that he had been defeated by a simple kick. The thought crossed his mind that Mars might be more like a monk than a swordsman. Mars reflected that his master had always fought in that manner, and because of that influence, he had learned to fight the same way. After that, Mars turned his attention toward Gamras. He pointed out that Gamras was now the only one left. For the first time, Gamras showed clear signs of fear. In his thoughts, he began to question how everything had reached this point. He had dedicated his entire life to the kingdom, believing that everything he had done was for the sake of its people. 15 years earlier, the kingdom had been in chaos, and the former queen had been responsible for that turmoil. At that time, Gamras had convinced the king to carry out a coup in order to save the kingdom. Since then, he had worked tirelessly with the nobles. Step by step, he had improved the country while carefully keeping the nobility under watch. For him, ruling the kingdom required accepting both its virtues and its corruption in order to maintain balance. Yet throughout all of his plans, Prince Mars had always been an obstacle. Eventually, Gamras believed that certain nobles would try to use Mars as a political puppet. To prevent that from happening, he had concluded that Mars had to be eliminated. Even though Mars himself had been innocent, Gamras had arranged poison, traps, and assassins to remove him. Yet somehow Mars had survived every attempt. Despite having no allies and no protection, he had endured it all. At that moment, Agma's voice rang out nearby. He announced that it was the end for the nobles, declaring that they had already crushed them all. He also pointed out that Gamras was the only one left. Mars was surprised to hear that every noble had already been defeated. The thought quickly crossed his mind that if 100 had truly killed all of the nobles, then the question of how the kingdom would be governed remained unanswered. Meanwhile, Gamras wondered whether Prince Mars and Zeros were actually the same person. The idea troubled him deeply. It suggested that Mars might have been building his own faction all along, preparing for this very day. Mars, however, quietly doubted that 100 could truly rule a kingdom. In the end, he began to think that perhaps it would be better to simply leave the throne to his father. Mars then turned his attention toward his father and brought up the matter of the throne. His father reacted with visible fear and immediately indicated that the throne belonged to Mars. Mars then asked whether there was anyone present who actually understood how to govern a kingdom. Hearing this question left Gamras in disbelief. Mars called Gamras forward and placed him in charge of handling the kingdom's affairs. The decision surprised Gamras. In the days that followed, the kingdom returned to order far faster than anyone had expected. Soon afterward, a wedding ceremony was held. Mars's bride was, of course, Frau. Frau had earned the trust of many people through her courage during the Civil War. Even so, she soon revealed a new interest. Her next goal was to attempt a summoning ritual that required human sacrifices. Hearing that idea made Mars quietly question whether it was truly acceptable for her to become queen. Meanwhile, Agma and the other members of 100 spent a great deal of time lecturing Mars about his decision to place Gamras in charge. Agma expressed his anger openly, reminding everyone that Gamras had once attempted to assassinate Mars and had been responsible for the entire situation. Chrome also questioned Mars's choice and asked whether he truly intended to leave Gamras in control of the kingdom's affairs. Mars then raised a simple point. If Gamras were not placed in charge, who else would manage the politics of the kingdom? The members of 100 were completely devoted to the belief that only the strongest were worthy. Because of that mindset, it was clear that none of them were suited to govern a kingdom. Since that decision, Gamras had worked without rest. At one point, Gamras expressed his loyalty toward Mars, recognizing him as a king above all kings. He declared that he would serve Mars with his life and carry out his duties faithfully. After some time had passed, Chrome formally proclaimed the coronation of the new king. Mars was crowned King Mars. People declared their glory to King Mars and expressed their hope that his reign would bring peace and prosperity to the kingdom. The members of 100 also pledged to follow Zeros wherever he chose to lead them. In truth, Mars had only ever wanted to survive. Yet somehow, the act of eating monster meat had led him all the way to the throne. Now, as King Mars, the question remained of how he would begin rebuilding the kingdom. And beyond that, no one yet knew what awaited him next. Some time later, Agma approached Luida, the cleric healer, carrying a cleanly sliced-off arm and asking her to take care of it. Luida was shocked at the sight at first. After some time passed, she managed to reattach the arm successfully. Agma reacted with clear satisfaction and proudly praised her, considering her their reliable older sister and recognizing her as a true A-rank cleric of remarkable ability. At that moment, a ranking match was taking place in the arena. The fight was between Agma, who held the first rank, and Bruno, who was ranked 5th. Both were members of 100, battling each other in the arena's official ranking matches. During the fight, Agma, clearly the stronger of the two, cut off Bruno's right arm with a single strike, leaving the battle in that brutal condition. Watching from the side, Mars thought that the spectacle was rather gruesome. He wondered how things had even reached this point. After he had ascended to the throne, Gamras had thrown himself into his duties with almost unsettling dedication. By seizing the wealth and assets of the nobles, the kingdom's finances had improved drastically. Even so, Mars had not yet rewarded the members of 100 for the support they had given during the rebellion. Then an idea suddenly came to him. He decided that they should build an arena. The old training grounds were far from ideal, and providing a proper arena as a reward for 100 would surely make everyone happy. When Mars presented the idea, Gamras asked whether the arena was meant to become a public spectacle. Mars indicated that the idea was something along those lines. Gamras then asked if Mars intended to turn the ranking battles into a national attraction. Mars wondered if that meant making it a government project where spectators would pay admission fees. Gamras clarified that it was not exactly what he meant. Mars questioned that response, and Gamras paused as if realizing something. In the next moment, Gamras enthusiastically concluded that the true idea must be gambling. Mars was confused by the assumption, since that had not been his intention. However, Gamras continued with growing excitement. By allowing people to place bets on the ranking matches of 100 and turning the arena into a national enterprise, the kingdom could create a powerful new source of revenue. Falun was a poor nation, and it lacked a strong main industry. To Gamras, the plan seemed brilliant. He even began to believe that Mars had foreseen this outcome from the very beginning when he first organized 100. Mars simply smiled and allowed Gamras to continue with that interpretation. If the plan benefited the kingdom, Mars saw no reason to object. Gamras grew even more enthusiastic, declaring that the arena would surely become one of the nation's greatest assets. He immediately began making arrangements to put the plan into action. Within half a year, the arena was completed. Thanks to the introduction of gambling on the ranking battles, the kingdom's revenue more than doubled. Elsewhere, another scene unfolded. A member of 100 named Aaron rushed in while carrying his injured friend. The man had a sword stabbed directly through his chest. Aaron desperately asked for help from Luida, the A-rank cleric. After examining the situation, Luida pointed out that a sword was still lodged in the man's chest. From her perspective, the man was already a corpse. She stated that saving him was impossible and then questioned why Aaron had stabbed his own friend if he truly cared about him. Aaron insisted that Luida was the only person capable of healing his friend and that there was still time to save him. Luida maintained that the situation was hopeless. Aaron, overwhelmed with desperation, cried and admitted that he did not know what he might do if Barry failed to return to life. At that moment, Agma arrived and told Aaron to calm himself. He then turned to Luida and insisted that everything would be fine if she simply brought Barry back to life. Agma raised his voice and warned that if she refused, no one could predict who might die next. He pressed the matter further, making it clear that she already understood the consequences. According to him, if she revived Barry, the situation would be settled. The men around them began crying and pleading with Luida, urging her to bring Barry back. Moved by the desperate situation, Luida offered her prayers with great effort. In what seemed like a miracle, Barry recovered. The men reacted with relief and admiration, praising Luida as an incredible healer and recognizing her as a true A-rank cleric. Luida warned them not to cause trouble for her again. She made it clear that the next time such a situation happened, she would turn the dead into zombies and send the killers straight to prison without any arguments. The men quickly agreed. Not long afterward, Mars was called to make preparations for a special match. In his mind, he realized that he had little choice but to go. He confirmed that he would be coming. From that point onward, Mars had to continue fulfilling his duties as king. In the arena, contestants such as Agma received prize money for their victories. They earned significant rewards, fought in front of cheering crowds, and became figures admired by many. These days, the rankers of 100 were treated like celebrities, enjoying wealth, fame, and prestige. Against these rankers, Mars fought 10 matches every day. Agma encouraged Mars to show his full strength once again and requested that he remove the armlets he had worn during the rebellion. Mars often found himself constantly pressured to fight. At one point, he had suggested a system. Anyone who won a ranking match would be granted a special match against him afterward. The idea had seemed clever at the time. Mars believed it would allow him to settle everyone's challenges at once and quickly silence their dissatisfaction. However, the result turned out differently. Warren mentioned that he had already earned his 5th special match. Aaron claimed that he had reached his 7th. Agma proudly stated that he had fought 100 matches without missing a single one. In Mars's mind, he wished they would stop challenging him to special matches again and again. He wanted them to show at least some restraint. Soon afterward, Agma and Warren rushed toward Mars, declaring that this would be the day they finally defeated him. Agma held firmly to the belief that they would never give up. No matter how many times they were knocked down, they would always rise again. Watching them, Mars could only think that they behaved almost like zombies. They surrounded him while shouting his name with excitement, calling out to King Mars and Lord Mars. Mars often wondered why he was always the one placed in this situation. He had been fighting these special matches almost every day, even though everyone else was allowed 5 full days of rest. As for Gamorous, Mars sometimes found himself wondering whether the man had once lived like a gladiator slave. Gamorous had insisted that whenever the king personally held special matches, the crowds would grow far larger, which meant they should continue the events as often as possible. No matter how many challengers Mars defeated, they kept returning again and again. The reason for this endless cycle was the cleric Luida. Mars had originally hired her to provide healing, but he had never imagined it would turn into such a relentless situation. In truth, Mars wanted to complain to Gamorous about it. Yet whenever he saw Gamorous working himself far beyond exhaustion, growing thinner while tirelessly managing the kingdom's affairs, Mars found that he could not bring himself to criticize him. Another victory for King Mars was announced, bringing that day's ranking matches to an end. However, Mars knew that the Real ordeal would begin afterward. Elsewhere, Luida was nervously praying while casting purification magic on herself. She repeatedly invoked cleansing winds to remove poison from her body. At the same time, she wondered why she was forced to eat poisoned food while constantly using detoxification spells to survive it. Meanwhile, in another dining room, Mars asked Gamorous whether the rumors were true that killer rabbits had nearly disappeared. Gamorous confirmed the reports, explaining that the creatures had almost vanished from the kingdom's territory. Mars found the idea surprising. He had never heard of monsters becoming extinct before. In his understanding, monsters were supposed to appear endlessly. Perhaps they had not truly disappeared but had simply been driven away from the region. Gamorous then added that recently even dragons had begun avoiding flying over the kingdom's lands. The members of 100 had been competing fiercely to hunt dragons for their valuable meat. In addition, Frau's mage corps had also joined the hunts using their magic. Hearing that dragons were now fleeing the territory, Mars began to wonder what kind of dangerous place the kingdom was becoming. Concerned, he considered that fewer monsters should normally be a good thing. Creatures like killer rabbits had once damaged crops and harmed local residents. Gamorous explained that the situation was not entirely positive. For people who were not accustomed to it, meat from monsters stronger than killer rabbits was extremely poisonous. Many of the new recruits joining 100 were unable to adapt to it. In Mars's mind, the obvious solution seemed simple. If the meat was poisonous and unpleasant, they could simply stop eating it. Mars reflected that he would personally prefer to eat something far tastier. If people liked killer rabbit meat that much, it would make more sense to raise the creatures themselves. Gamorous paused to clarify the idea, wondering if Mars truly meant raising monsters. The suggestion impressed him greatly. Ignoring conventional thinking and proposing something so unusual struck Gamorous as remarkable. Meanwhile, Mars immediately realized the problem. Gamorous was taking the suggestion seriously. If the kingdom actually began breeding monsters for food, other nations would almost certainly think they had lost their minds. Mars clarified that the idea was not about raising monsters for food. Gamorous immediately interpreted it differently and considered whether the purpose might be for display instead. In his thoughts, Mars was confused about how Gamorous's reasoning had taken such an unusual direction. Mars made it clear that it was not intended for entertainment either. Gamorous continued thinking and arrived at another conclusion. From his perspective, perhaps the true purpose was breeding monsters as the first step toward incorporating them into the kingdom's military strength. Mars's eyes widened at the suggestion. Gamorous became increasingly impressed, believing that Mars was revealing a grand vision. He pointed out that the northern kingdoms already raised dragons and trained dragon riders. Following that example, they could strengthen their own forces by raising monsters as well. Mars struggled to follow Gamorous' reasoning. The idea of breeding monsters for warfare sounded completely unreasonable to him. The thought even crossed his mind that such a plan sounded more like something a demon lord would attempt. However, Gamorous continued analyzing the idea enthusiastically. Whether for meat, spectacle, or military strength, raising monsters appeared to offer many possible benefits. It was certainly a challenging concept, but in his view it was worth attempting. Mars quickly tried to deny that this had been his intention. Yet just as he attempted to speak, he suddenly noticed that no sound was coming from his voice. Confused, he turned his head and looked behind him. Frau was standing there. Mars and Frau were connected through a contract seal, which meant she could easily have overheard his entire conversation with Gamera's before teleporting to his side. Mars also noticed that she was casting some form of magic. At that moment, it became clear to him that his voice had stopped working because of her. Mars then questioned whether Frau truly wanted to begin breeding monsters. Frau simply acknowledged the idea with quiet interest. Realizing this, Mars immediately concluded that preparations would have to begin at once. Trying to stop her would be pointless. In Mars's mind, once Frau developed an interest in something, there was no turning back. Attempting to restrain her would only cause her to lash out once her obsession was denied. Such an outcome would be disastrous for everyone. The idea of breeding monsters for military purposes was now beginning to take shape. At that time, however, Mars did not realize the consequences. The relentless hunting of monsters by so many people would eventually lead to a far greater calamity. In the kingdom of Falun, a plan for the mass production of monsters had begun. It was reassuring in one sense that Frau appeared pleased with the idea. Even so, Mars could not help wondering whether it was truly necessary to turn monsters into military power. Falun was a small and remote kingdom, and no nation would normally bother invading it. If only there were some way for him to escape the situation. At times he even thought that perhaps someone from 100 could take his place in those special matches. Nearby, Chrome called out to King Mars and asked him to look at a gravity bracelet he had obtained. Chrome explained that with such a bracelet, he might come a little closer to Mars's level of strength. Mars reacted with confusion. In his mind, the bracelet was nothing more than a prisoner's shackle. It had originally been created to prevent prisoners from escaping, a bracelet infused with heavy gravity magic. In some countries, criminals would receive one of these for free as punishment. The strange part was that these enthusiastic users were supposed to be the elite soldiers of Mars's own kingdom. Then again, Mars realized that he himself was hardly in a position to criticize them. Not long after, Frau presented Mars with a gift. It was another bracelet. She explained that she had created it herself and that enchanting it with a gravity effect 5 times stronger had been extremely difficult. The thought of 5 times gravity immediately concerned Mars. Magic of that level would require tremendous skill. Mars tried to insist that the bracelet he already wore, the one with 3 times gravity, was more than enough. In his mind, a 5-fold gravity effect would definitely interfere with daily life. Frau then looked at him seriously and mentioned the name Cassandra. She pointed out that Mars had been wearing items given to him by Cassandra and possibly other women. The comment left Mars visibly uneasy. Because of the contract sigil connecting them, Frau was always able to observe him. When it came to Mars, she could see almost everything. Even the existence of Cassandra, his master, had never escaped her awareness. In fact, Frau had been the only one who knew. The poison ring and the gravity bracelet with triple gravity that Mars wore now had both been gifts from his master. To be honest, their effects were rather unpleasant. Mars privately thought that a bit of jealousy from Frau could be somewhat charming. However, he truly wished she would not try to compete in this particular way. He suggested that if she wanted to give him a gift, something offering magical protection would be more suitable. A powerful enchanted item that could keep him safe would have been ideal. Frau, however, believed that strengthening her husband was the duty of a wife. In Mars's mind, he could not help wondering what kind of wife thought that way. Frau then looked directly at him, silently questioning whether he was rejecting the gift. Mars felt uneasy, realizing that he could not easily guess what she was thinking. At the same time, he knew that Frau genuinely worked hard for his sake. When others had suggested breaking their engagement, she had refused without hesitation. Even during the earlier rebellion, she had risked her life to stand beside him. Mars did not dislike Frau. Although she sometimes seemed to lack certain human emotions, she was still someone dear to him as his wife. In the end, Mars accepted the gift and agreed to wear the gravity bracelet she had made. He expressed his gratitude to her. The moment he did so, the throne beneath him could not withstand the sudden weight and shattered. Not long after, inside the throne room, a guard approached and informed Mars that a messenger from the kingdom of Cadnia had arrived and wished to present a message. Cadnia was a neighboring country that also bordered the demon beast forest. Unlike Falun, it had a much longer history and was considered a higher-ranked nation. Both kingdoms struggled against the dangers of the demon beast forest, so maintaining diplomatic relations between them would normally be beneficial. Mars began reading the letter sent by the king of Cadnia. At first, he thought that this might finally be an opportunity to perform a proper duty as king. However, his expression soon turned uneasy. The letter was essentially a complaint. According to the message, Falun had hunted monsters so aggressively that the natural balance of the region had been disrupted. As a result, monsters were now flooding into Cadnia's territory and causing serious damage. Because of this, Falun was being asked to take responsibility by hunting the monsters within Cadnia's lands as well. In addition, the letter demanded compensation of 3,000 gold coins. After considering the contents, Mars quietly concluded that the situation was indeed bad. If their relentless hunting had reached the point where even dragons were avoiding their territory, then it was only natural that the surrounding countries would be affected. The realization made it clear that they had created a serious problem. Mars handed the letter to Gamras so that he could read it. After reading the contents, Gamras immediately recognized that the kingdom of Cadnia was blaming Falun for the surge of monsters entering their territory. The accusation left him incredulous. Gamras reacted strongly, arguing that every nation was responsible for managing its own monster subjugation. He questioned whether Cadnia had lost its sense of national pride. The messenger, Lord Odd, calmly responded that the situation was not so simple. Until recently, Cadnia had handled the monsters within its own territory without difficulty. However, in recent years Falun had been hunting monsters excessively and rapidly expanding deeper into the demon beast forest. Because of that expansion, the monsters that fled were now pouring into Cadnia's lands, creating a crisis they were struggling to control. Hearing this explanation, Mars realized that the reckless actions of his own people had genuinely caused serious trouble for Cadnia. Warren then spoke, defending their country's policy. From his perspective, Falun's national strategy had always been to subjugate monsters and develop the demon beast forest. Because of that, he believed there was no reason for another nation to condemn them. Agma also raised his voice in agreement. In his view, if the number of monsters had increased in Cadnia's territory, they should simply defeat them themselves. To him, complaining about such a situation seemed pathetic. Aaron, on the other hand, reacted with enthusiasm and argued that if the number of monsters increased, they should simply eat them. He even pointed out that in their own country they were actually running short of monsters. Mars quietly reflected that not everyone thought the way Aaron did. In truth, he genuinely felt sorry for Cadnia. Meanwhile, Lord Odd considered the situation carefully. From a diplomatic standpoint, he understood that the demand they had delivered was unreasonable. However, the king of Cadnia was extremely angry. As a diplomat, Lord Odd had no choice but to present those demands to Falun. In reality, all he wanted was to finish the matter and return home as quickly as possible. The presence of King Mars made him deeply uneasy. When Lord Odd looked toward Mars, the king responded with a smile that somehow felt unsettling. To Lord Odd, Mars appeared like an ordinary noble at first glance. Yet the rumors surrounding him told a far darker story. It was said that Mars had once been a troublesome prince who had nearly been disinherited. When he realized he was about to lose his claim to the throne, he supposedly adopted the name Mars, gathered a group of outlaws, and launched a rebellion. According to those rumors, he had slaughtered the nobles who opposed him, making him a terrifying figure. There were also stories claiming that he forced his followers to eat the poisonous flesh of monsters as a test of loyalty. After becoming king, he had even built an arena where his own subordinates were made to fight. To Lord Odd, the purpose behind all of this seemed simple: gambling, revenue, and entertainment. In his mind, King Mars was truly a mad king. Because of that reputation, Lord Odd believed there was no way Mars would accept the unreasonable demands from Cadnia. Gamras reacted immediately, declaring that the request was absolutely out of the question and that the matter was already settled. Then King Mars spoke. He announced that Falun would comply with Cadnia's request. The decision shocked everyone present. Mars reasoned that there were already countless people in his kingdom eager to hunt monsters. They were also earning enormous profits from the arena, so the task would not cause any real difficulty. Beyond that, maintaining good relations with a neighboring nation was simply the sensible choice. Chrome reacted with concern and urged King Mars to reconsider. From his perspective, accepting such a demand would make their kingdom appear weak in the eyes of other nations. Mars understood Chrome's point. In negotiations, appearing too soft could invite disrespect. However, the reality remained that Falun's own actions had created the problem in the first place. Beyond that, Mars had his own personal reason. In his mind, this situation presented a perfect opportunity to take Frau on a trip outside the kingdom. Mars then declared that preparations for the expedition would begin over the next month. During that time, he ordered the captain of the Black Knights, Chrome, to assist Cadnia in subjugating monsters. Chrome acknowledged the order, but the realization of what he had just agreed to quickly caught up with him. Mars then turned to Lord Odd and asked whether the arrangements sounded acceptable. He also asked whether it would cause any problems if Falun's forces entered Cadnia during the monster subjugation efforts. Lord Odd immediately assured him that it would not be a problem at all. He stated that Cadnia had no objections and expressed deep gratitude for King Mars's generosity. After some time had passed, Chrome approached King Mars and asked him to explain the true reason behind his decision. He requested an explanation that everyone could clearly understand. Mars quietly reflected that he might have gone too far earlier. Simply admitting that he wanted to visit another country would not be appropriate for a king. Realizing this, he began searching for a convincing excuse. Then Mars snapped his fingers as an idea came to him. He announced that there was a possibility of a monster stampede. The people around him reacted with surprise. Gamras quickly interpreted the statement, explaining that the king was considering the potential risk of a stampede. A stampede referred to a situation where an overwhelming number of monsters suddenly swarmed into an area. The exact cause was often unknown, but excessive hunting of monsters was known to trigger such events. Recently, monster activity within Cadnea had been increasing. King Mars explained that if something provoked the monsters further, a stampede could easily occur. If such a disaster happened, the kingdom of Cadnea would suffer severe destruction. Gamras quickly grasped the reasoning and concluded that this must be why they intended to subjugate the monsters in advance. Hearing that interpretation, Mars felt relieved that his explanation had been accepted. If a stampede were to occur in Cadnea, it would also threaten Falun itself. In that sense, the expedition could be viewed as an act of national defense. Mars quietly found himself impressed with how convincing his excuse had become. King Mars then asked Chrome whether he now understood the reasoning behind the decision. Chrome expressed his understanding and stated that he now recognized the depth of King Mars's wisdom. Filled with determination, Chrome declared that the task of monster subjugation in Cadnea should be entrusted entirely to the Black Knights. He promised that they would carry out the mission without fail. Mars privately thought that they were becoming far too enthusiastic about the task, though at least their motivation was strong. 1 month later, the expedition finally began. Mars reflected that this journey would be his first trip together with Frau, and he found himself genuinely looking forward to it. By now, the monster subjugation efforts should already have been completed, and the king of Cadnea would likely be waiting to welcome them. However, Mars soon began to wonder why the operation had grown so large. He had originally expected something like a diplomatic envoy, mostly officials and scholars traveling together. Instead, the sight before him looked more like a full military campaign. At that moment, Agma approached and informed King Mars that they had reached the capital of Cadnea, Mas. When Mars looked ahead, he was stunned by what he saw. The capital city of Cadnea was completely surrounded by monsters. The sight left him in disbelief. He had believed that the Black Knights had already exterminated them. Half a month earlier, Chrome had been reflecting on the extraordinary foresight of King Mars. At first, he had struggled to understand why Mars had agreed to the demands made by Cadnea. However, as he thought about it more deeply, everything began to make sense in his mind. To Chrome, it seemed obvious that King Mars must have anticipated such a foolish request from Cadnea. In fact, Chrome believed that Mars had deliberately continued developing the demon beast forest precisely to provoke such a situation. From his perspective, Mars had never truly been worried about a monster stampede. Instead, he must have intended to use it as a strategic weapon. Chrome became convinced that the entire situation had been planned. By creating a stampede of monsters, Mars would gain the opportunity to bring Cadnea under his control. Following that belief, Chrome scattered a strange black liquid throughout the forest. Within the kingdom of Falun, research had been underway to discover methods for mass-producing monsters. One of their latest developments was this liquid. When spread across an area, it would attract monsters in large numbers, drawing them in like moths toward a flame. Chrome believed that once the liquid spread across Cadnea's lands, monsters would gather there in overwhelming numbers. Although such an event would devastate Cadnea, Chrome was convinced that King Mars had already accounted for this outcome. At the height of the stampede, Mars and Lady Frau would arrive and save the towns and villages under attack. By doing so, they would gain influence within Cadnea and establish a foothold in the country. Chrome laughed with admiration at what he believed to be Mars's strategy. To him, every move made by King Mars was flawless. In his mind, this battle would become the first step toward Mars's eventual conquest of the entire continent of Ares. With that conviction, Chrome celebrated the brilliance of his king. Back in the present, Agma remarked that the Black Knights appeared to have executed the plan perfectly. Mars reacted with confusion, unable to understand what plan Agma was referring to. Agma seemed equally confused by Mars's reaction. Mars continued questioning what Agma meant, insisting that the obvious course of action was simply to help Cadnea. Without hesitation, Mars issued an order. Every single monster surrounding the capital was to be exterminated. Mars wondered why monsters were attacking the royal capital of Mos. Chrome and his men were supposed to have already dealt with them. Regardless of the reason, there was only one thing that could be done now. Every last monster had to be wiped out. Even so, Mars noticed that there were still far too many of them. At the same time, he could not afford to be late for his meeting with the king of Cadnea. Nearby, Frau began reciting an incantation. Her spell called upon darkness beyond crimson, returning everything to the void. Black flames born from the depths of the underworld erupted outward. Mars observed the spell and thought that its power was extraordinary. He then ordered the Black Knights to take care of the monsters. However, he could not help wondering why the situation had grown so severe that even the capital itself was under attack. Soon after, someone approached him and expressed gratitude for his assistance. The man introduced himself as George, the captain of the knights responsible for guarding Moss. Mars considered the moment fortunate and immediately requested that Captain George arrange an audience with the king of Cadnia. At the same time, Mars quietly wondered how he was supposed to explain this disaster to the king. Captain George then delivered troubling news. He regretted to inform Mars that the king of Cadnia was not present. Mars reacted with surprise. George explained that after receiving reports of the approaching monster horde, the king had fled Moss together with the royal guard. Hearing this, Mars felt a sense of relief. At least he would not need to apologize directly to the king. In his mind, he thought that if the monsters were eliminated quickly, perhaps the king would overlook the situation when he eventually returned. Mars then asked whether monsters were also attacking other cities throughout Cadnia. Captain George confirmed that they were. Unfortunately, their forces did not have the strength necessary to contain the attacks. Mars immediately realized how serious the situation was. If the damage continued to spread, the compensation money they had promised would never be enough. He then stated that he understood the situation and declared that his forces would handle it. Captain George reacted with confusion, insisting that the kingdom of Falun should not go that far for their sake. From his perspective, Cadnia still had its pride to consider. Mars responded sharply, questioning whether they truly intended to sacrifice their own people simply to protect their pride. Hearing that, Captain George acknowledged that Mars's words were correct. Nearby, Agma called out to King Mars to report that the monsters outside the castle had already been cleared. Most of the monsters that had managed to enter the city had also been dealt with. Captain George struggled to believe what he was hearing. To him, defeating that many monsters in such a short time sounded impossible. King Mars acknowledged their efforts and praised them for their work. At the same time, Mars quietly reflected that these were the kind of people who could drive monsters to extinction without a moment's hesitation. Soon after, the members of 100 began moving out to confront the monsters invading the rest of Cadnia. They intended to hunt them down completely and would not allow a single one to escape. Everything was done for the sake of their king. Not long before Mars and his forces arrived in Moss, the king of Cadnia had been struggling to understand how the situation had deteriorated so badly. Monsters had begun surrounding his entire nation, and to him it felt as if the kingdom was on the brink of collapse. He had originally intended to send a formal complaint to Falun and demand that they eliminate the monsters threatening Cadnia. Frustration filled his thoughts as he questioned what the soldiers of Falun were actually doing. They had claimed they would reduce the monster population. The coachman accompanying him confirmed that the Black Knights had supposedly gone to subjugate the beasts in the Demon Beast Forest. The king began to suspect something darker. Perhaps the Black Knights had set everything up deliberately. An even more troubling thought followed. What if the entire situation had been part of a scheme created by the kingdom of Falun from the very beginning? Those suspicions unsettled him deeply. Then a scream echoed from outside. The king stepped out of his carriage to see what had happened, only to be confronted by a horrifying sight. His men had been slaughtered. Confused and alarmed, he struggled to understand what was happening. At that moment, Chrome appeared before him. Chrome greeted the king politely and introduced himself along with his position. The king reacted with shock upon hearing that he was from the Black Knights. From his perspective, the Black Knights were supposed to be defeating the monsters. He questioned whether they were breaking the promise they had made. Chrome calmly explained that they had not broken their promise. According to him, the Black Knights had already eliminated a large number of monsters. By the time they had arrived, the invading monsters had already been greatly reduced. Still confused, the king asked why his country remained under attack. Chrome then explained one of the dangerous traits of monsters. The scent of slain monsters often attracted stronger predators. If extermination efforts were carried out half-heartedly, the result would simply invite even more monsters into the area. The king of Cadnia dismissed the explanation as nonsense. In his experience, there had never been any case where defeating monsters had caused a stampede. Chrome responded by revealing that there was another factor involved. He then produced a potion created by alchemists in their country. Chrome explained that the substance had the ability to attract monsters. When spread across a wide area, it would draw them in, and when mixed with the blood of monsters, the effect would grow dramatically stronger. According to him, the potion had been scattered from the Demon Beast Forest all the way to Moss. The king reacted with shock at the revelation. He repeated the information in disbelief and questioned whether Chrome had truly spread such a potion to lure monsters. The realization quickly followed that Chrome had intentionally triggered the stampede. Chrome did not directly confirm the accusation. Instead, he calmly remarked that actions had indeed been taken that resulted in a stampede. He then became serious and pointed out that none of this would have happened if the king had not invited foreign knights into his country. Hearing that left the king unsettled. The king questioned why Falun had not simply refused the request instead of going to such extremes. Chrome answered that every foolish decision the king had made had already been anticipated as part of King Mars's plan. With that, Chrome moved to finish the situation. He threw the potion directly onto the king's face. The king demanded to know what Chrome intended to do. Chrome explained that the potion would still work even without monster blood. Realizing his fate, the king of Cadnia panicked. He desperately offered Chrome rewards in exchange for his loyalty, promising land, titles, and anything else he desired if he would side with Cadnia. He pleaded for his life. Chrome responded by thrusting his sword into the king's body. He explained that in their country, there were no knights who would betray their king for land or money. Soon after, monsters were drawn to the area. They approached the king's body and began devouring it. In the end, the king of Cadnia was mauled by monsters as he tried to flee. 3 days later, the people of Cadnia expressed their gratitude toward Mars. They celebrated the fact that Moss had been saved and began calling him the savior of Cadnia. Mars quietly reflected on the situation. The monsters had been defeated and peace had returned to the country without too much difficulty. That part of the outcome was acceptable. However, another problem had appeared. The king of Cadnia was dead. While it meant there was no longer anyone to complain about the situation, it also created a new complication. Mars could no longer simply return to Falun. After arriving in Moss, Mars had sent the knights escorting him out to hunt the remaining monsters. Meanwhile, he personally traveled to cities that had suffered heavy damage and helped with the recovery efforts. During these visits, he also distributed gold coins to those affected. Mars understood that spending gold for the sake of Cadnia might set a precedent. Even so, he hoped that by doing so, the kingdom might choose not to argue about reparations later. Mars noticed that the people seemed genuinely happy, and the situation made him feel that the money had not been poorly spent. After that, he reunited with the Black Knights in Moss. Chrome reported to one of the officials that the king of Cadnia had died during a monster attack. According to the report, the king's body had been discovered along the highway, torn apart by beasts in a gruesome state. The official reacted with anger and disbelief. The thought that their king had fled only to be killed by monsters after everything that had happened filled him with frustration. To him, the situation felt utterly pathetic. Amid the chaos, many citizens of Cadnia began declaring that they could no longer remain in a country like this. Some even expressed their intention to pledge loyalty to the kingdom of Falun. Mars was stunned by the development. The people continued thanking him for saving them and for the gold he had distributed during the recovery efforts. Soon afterward, Captain George approached King Mars and requested a moment of his time. He explained that the Princess of Cadnia wished to meet him. According to George, Princess Rubis of Cadnia had remained inside the castle throughout the crisis and had never fled. Captain George conveyed the princess's message exactly as she had given it. She had been deeply moved by the stories of King Mars saving the people of Cadnia and expressed a strong desire to meet him personally. King Mars agreed to meet her. However, Captain George added another request from the princess. She wished for the meeting to remain strictly confidential and preferred it to take the form of a private dinner attended only by Mars himself. Mars indicated that he had no objections. Then he hesitated for a moment. Even if the meeting was kept secret from others, he knew that Frau would likely hear everything through the contract mark connecting them. Meanwhile, Princess Rubis quietly wondered what would become of Cadnia from that point forward. The royal family of Cadnia had lost nearly all credibility. Their king had died in disgrace, and in the aftermath the people began praising Mars, a king from another nation. Stories spread quickly about how he had distributed gold throughout the disaster-stricken areas. Naturally, such generosity won the hearts of the people. As for the source of that gold, it was widely believed that it came from the reparations that the princess's own father had demanded from Falun. Princess Rubis reflected on the situation and noticed how neatly everything seemed to fall into place. Even so, she could not ignore the feeling that the events were almost too perfect. Falun had agreed to those reparations far too easily. From the beginning, that decision had felt unusual. She began to wonder whether everything had been a carefully staged performance by King Mars. Perhaps he had turned Cadnia's demands against them and then triggered the monster stampede himself, using the chaos as a pretext to invade. In her thoughts, King Mars appeared as a cold and calculating figure. Even if she were to shout that the entire situation had been Falun's plan, she realized that there was no concrete proof. Without evidence, her accusation would only sound like a desperate excuse from a disgraced royal family. And even if proof somehow existed, the reputation of Falun's generosity and strength had already spread everywhere. The people would likely refuse to believe it. King Mars was known for both strength and strategy, and little by little he was winning over the hearts of the people. Yet Princess Rubis believed she alone understood the truth. Behind his back, some people referred to him as the Mad King. To her, that title felt appropriate. She considered the possibility that if King Mars truly took control of Cadnia, It might lead to terrible consequences. Perhaps she was the only one who could see that danger now. For the sake of her kingdom and its people, she concluded that she had to act. After all, she was the princess of the nation. With that resolve, Princess Rubis decided that she would be the one to take King Mars's life. Meanwhile, inside the castle of Cadnia, a raised voice questioned the idea of assassinating King Mars. Lady Rubis confirmed that the plan was indeed to eliminate him. In her view, the monster stampede had most likely been deliberate, part of a plot by King Mars to annex Cadnia into Falun's territory. Lady Rubis explained that the hearts of the people were already beginning to lean toward Mars. Much of southern Cadnia had effectively fallen under Falun's influence. If they wished to save their country, she believed that King Mars had to be defeated. Captain George questioned how such a thing could possibly be accomplished. From his perspective, there was no one in their nation capable of defeating King Mars in battle. When Mars and the Knights of Hundred entered Moss, they had wiped out monsters that even Cadnia's royal army could not overcome. To George, those men were nothing less than an army of living legends. Lady Rubis insisted that there was still one possible method. They would poison King Mars. Captain George reacted with shock upon hearing the proposal. He pointed out that Mars's wife, Lady Frau, was an extremely powerful magician. If she were present, she might easily detect poison through magic. Lady Rubis responded that the poisoning would take place while Mars was alone. A private meal would be arranged, attended only by herself and King Mars. She then asked whether Captain George would assist her with the plan. In her thoughts, Lady Rubis understood that the situation had to be handled carefully. If retaliation followed, it could devastate Cadnia. The responsibility had to fall entirely on her alone. She was prepared to settle the matter even if it meant sacrificing her own life. Later, during the arranged dinner, Mars reacted with clear enjoyment at the food placed before him. He recognized it as traditional Cadnian court cuisine and felt grateful for the hospitality he had been shown. To Lady Rubis's surprise, King Mars had actually arrived alone. She could hardly believe that he had come without any protection. A small sense of guilt appeared in her mind, yet the situation also worked in her favor. In her thoughts, she reviewed the plan carefully. Every dish on the table had been laced with poison. The intention was to ensure that she could respond even if Mars asked to exchange plates. Once Mars consumed enough of the food, the poison would begin taking effect. She imagined him collapsing in agony, coughing blood as the poison destroyed him. Lady Rubis realized that she had never carried out such a plot before, and the tension began to make her nervous. Meanwhile, Mars quietly noticed how tense she appeared. To him, she seemed very young, and in a way he even found her somewhat endearing. Eventually, Mars began speaking, pointing out that Lady Rubis had been the one who requested the meeting. He wondered what exactly she wished to discuss. Lady Rubis then explained that her grandfather, Duke Gordon, was a powerful noble who ruled in northern Cadnia. Lady Rubis quietly reflected that if she steered the conversation toward politics, King Mars would almost certainly take interest in it. Meanwhile, King Mars commented on how pleasant the traditional Cadnian dishes were. As he continued eating, Lady Rubis felt her nerves tightening. She wondered whether he had noticed the poison hidden in the food. At the same time, she believed she needed to encourage him to continue eating. Trying to maintain her composure, she praised the cuisine herself and suggested that the dishes had turned out particularly well. She wondered aloud whether the food suited his taste. King Mars reacted with cheerful approval. He seemed to enjoy the sharp spices and found the flavor deeply satisfying. Watching him continue eating dish after dish, Lady Rubis began to wonder what kind of person he truly was. Despite the poison, he appeared completely content as he devoured the meal. Quietly, she leaned toward Captain George and whispered her confusion about the situation. George answered in a low voice that the food served to King Mars had definitely been poisoned as planned. In her thoughts, Lady Rubis began to feel that King Mars was almost inhuman. The antidote she had taken herself was not perfect either. If she kept consuming poisoned food alongside him, she might soon place herself in serious danger. While she worried about the poison, Mars had his own thoughts. After the dinner, he would still need to deal with the political situation in Cadnia, and an idea had begun forming in his mind. He then asked Lady Rubis about her age. She answered that she was 14. Mars noted that he had expected that. His younger brother was also 14, and when he first saw Rubis, he felt they appeared to be about the same age. In his mind, Mars began considering a simple solution. Perhaps he could entrust the leadership of Cadnia to his younger brother Nickel. Since Nickel and Rubis were the same age, the two of them might manage the situation together without much trouble. Hearing his words, Lady Rubis felt confused. The thought crossed her mind that perhaps this was a proposal of marriage. She wondered whether King Mars was attempting to arrange a political union. Her suspicion quickly deepened. If she were married to Mars's younger brother, it would allow Falun to annex Cadnia smoothly. The idea horrified her. She began to feel as though King Mars had already seen through their entire plan and that they had been moving exactly as he wished. When Mars asked what she thought of the idea, he added that Nickel was skilled with political matters and that he was certain Nickel and Rubis would get along well. Lady Rubis realized that she needed to decline carefully while maintaining proper royal decorum. However, the poison was already beginning to affect her. Her head felt increasingly light and unfocused. In her thoughts, she understood that the meeting had to end soon. She needed to obtain the antidote as quickly as possible. Lady Rubis finally responded to King Mars's suggestion by indicating that she would consider it positively. King Mars appeared pleased with the response. Soon after, Lady Rubis excused herself and left the table. Mars looked somewhat puzzled as she departed, noticing that there was still food remaining. In that way, the meeting came to an end without any visible conflict. Immediately afterward, King Mars contacted Gamaras in Falun through magic. He informed Gamaras that he intended to place Nickel in charge of Cadnia. The news surprised Gamaras, though he acknowledged the instruction. As he reflected on the meaning of the decision, Gamaras concluded that Mars must be implying that Nickel should marry the princess of Cadnia and eventually rule the country as its king. In Gamaras's thoughts, Nickel was both Mars's half-brother and his own grandson. When Mars first took the throne, Gamaras had once believed Nickel would be eliminated. In fact, Nickel had even been involved in the earlier assassination plot against Mars. Yet Mars had spared his life. To Gamaras, that act now seemed far more deliberate. It felt as if Mars had preserved Nickel not out of simple mercy but in preparation for a future role. The realization filled Gamaras with admiration. He believed he was witnessing the depth of Mars's foresight. Overwhelmed with excitement, Gamaras praised King Mars and expressed gratitude for arranging what he believed to be a remarkable match for Nickel. Some time later, Nickel met with King Mars and expressed his thanks for being entrusted with such an important responsibility. Nickel declared his determination not to disappoint him. Meanwhile, Mars quietly wondered why Nickel had brought his mother along and felt confused about the talk of a fine match. Even so, he noted that Nickel at least seemed motivated. Mars then instructed Nickel to work together with Lady Rubis and give his best effort. Nickel asked about the current whereabouts of Princess Rubis. Mars replied that she should be somewhere in the castle, though he had heard that she was not feeling well. Nearby, Chrome asked whether he should accompany Nickel. Mars agreed that it sounded reasonable. In Mars's view, allowing Nickel to tour the castle should not cause any problems, especially if Chrome was present. With that thought, he entrusted the matter to Chrome, who obediently accepted the task. Not long afterward, a scream echoed through the corridor. Several knights of Cadnia had been taken down by Chrome. He calmly instructed them not to interfere and questioned why anyone would attempt to obstruct the future king of Cadnia. Captain George quickly arrived at the scene and urged everyone to wait. He acknowledged that Chrome served the king of Falun but argued that such violence was unnecessary. Chrome responded by pointing out that Lord Nickel had traveled all the way there to meet his future wife. From his perspective, there was no reason why Captain George could not indulge Nickel's wishes just a little. Prince Nickel stepped forward and explained that the matter had already been decided. According to him, the arrangement had been settled between his grandfather, Gamaras, and the princess's grandfather, Duke Gordon. In his account, both men had been pleased with the outcome and had even expressed their gratitude to King Mars. Captain George found the claim absurd and insisted that Duke Gordon would never agree to such a thing. Nickel responded calmly, explaining that Rubis would become the queen of Cadnia and suggesting that such an outcome was not necessarily unfavorable. He then turned his attention toward George and hinted that exposing the princess's actions toward his brother would not end well. Frustration began to appear on George's face. George demanded to know what Nickel was implying. Nickel explained that such situations occurred in every country. In his view, people always attempted to assassinate his brother, though he personally found such efforts foolish. With a confident smile, Nickel expressed the belief that a true king could not be brought down by ordinary people. Chrome supported Nickel's stance and pressed George to make a decision. From Chrome's perspective, George could either continue resisting or step aside, and the outcome would make little difference. Realizing that there was nothing left he could do, George finally gave in. At that moment, Lady Rubis emerged from her room and assured George that the situation was now under control. She then invited Nickel to enter her room for a private conversation. Nickel accepted the invitation. Once inside, Lady Rubis asked Nickel what exactly Falun wanted from Cadnia. Nickel answered that they wanted nothing from the country itself. Their goal, as he described it, was simply to build a better Cadnia together. Rubis responded by stating that Cadnia had already been a good country before Falun's involvement. Nickel found the claim interesting and questioned whether that had truly been the case. In his reasoning, if the country had truly been good, its people would not have turned toward King Mars so easily. If the kingdom had been governed well, there would have been no reason for a foreign power to intervene in the first place. Nickel then reflected on the purpose of a nation and suggested that it existed for its people. Rubis agreed with that principle. Nickel argued that if the well-being of the people was the priority, then Caednia had even more reason to stand alongside Falun. In his view, no ruler cared for the people as much as his brother. Rubis reacted with anger and rejected the idea entirely. She pointed out that even children had heard the rumors about Falun's Mad King. According to those stories, wherever Mars went, bloodshed and death followed. He had seized power alongside bandits, slaughtered the nobility, consumed the poisonous flesh of monsters, and built an arena purely for his own amusement. In her mind, before discussing whether Mars deserved the title of king, it was necessary to question whether he could even be considered a decent person. Nickel acknowledged that many of those claims could not be completely denied. However, he also pointed out that his brother had never harmed ordinary civilians. Instead, he had removed nobles who neglected their people and hunted monsters that threatened villages and towns. Because of those actions, Mars had gained overwhelming support from the citizens of Falun and was now gaining the support of the people of Caednia as well. Nickel continued explaining that after the nobility had been removed in Falun, the system of intermediaries who skimmed taxes had disappeared as well. As a result, the nation's income increased while the burden placed on ordinary people decreased. In Nickel's view, no one in their country spoke poorly of King Mars anymore. Hearing this, Rubis found it difficult to believe. Gradually, her mood changed. The anger she had carried earlier faded, replaced by a quiet calm. In her thoughts, it felt as though everything she had once believed about Mars and Falun had shattered in an instant. Nickel then suggested that she visit Falun someday and see the reality with her own eyes. At the same time, he expressed his satisfaction that the person who would become his bride was both intelligent and charming. Some time later, Nickel and Rubis were married in a grand ceremony. The event also marked the official incorporation of Caednia under the authority of Falun. Mars felt pleased that relations with Caednia had improved. Even so, he could not help wondering how the two of them had ended up getting married in the first place. Elsewhere, inside another castle, King Dorson received a humble request asking for his assistance in reclaiming the kingdom of Caednia. As he listened, King Dorson quietly regarded the royal petitioners with contempt. In his thoughts, he considered them pathetic. If they and their late king had possessed even a trace of competence, Falun would never have managed to seize their kingdom in the first place. His mind turned toward the figure known as the Mad King Mars. Ever since Mars had taken the throne, Falun had transformed into something entirely different. To Dorson, Falun had once been a weak and unremarkable kingdom. Yet it had used the monster stampede as a convenient excuse to swallow Caednia almost overnight. Although Falun was still too small to pose a serious threat, its growing ambition had become impossible to ignore. In Dorson's view, King Mars was nothing more than an arrogant upstart who had become far too bold. Outwardly, however, King Dorson expressed understanding toward the royal visitors. He stated that he could not overlook Falun's aggression. The displaced royals responded with gratitude. Privately, Dorson was already forming his own plans. The two royals before him would serve as puppet kings. Once Caednia was reclaimed, they would act as his eyes and ears within the kingdom. As a first step, he intended to send a diplomatic demand requesting the return of the throne. If Falun surrendered the territory peacefully, the situation would resolve itself easily. Yet Dorson doubted that Falun would yield so simply. In his mind, the matter would almost certainly lead to war. If victory came, he would rule from behind the scenes while allowing the supposed rightful heirs to stand at the front. What happened to the kingdom afterward meant little to him. His true objective was simple: to crush Falun's rising power before it spread further. Elsewhere, King Mars received troubling news. A request had arrived demanding that the throne of Caednia be returned to its former crown prince. Mars questioned whether the letter truly came from King Dorson. Gamras confirmed that there was no doubt about its origin. At the same time, a second letter had arrived. This one was from Nickel. The message suggested that a war with Dorson was highly likely and requested the deployment of Falun's strongest forces. Mars found himself stunned by the situation. In his mind, Nickel had always seemed like a quiet and scholarly person. When Mars placed Caednia under Nickel's authority, he had expected the arrangement to remain peaceful. In truth, Mars had never cared much about keeping Caednia in the first place. The territory was troublesome, and it had never originally belonged to Falun anyway. However, Nickel had married the princess and become king. Mars tried to remember how the situation had unfolded so quickly. It seemed as though the marriage had happened within only a couple of weeks. Now King Dorson had become their opponent. Meanwhile, the members of Hundred were once again filled with excitement. To them, the possibility of war was something they welcomed eagerly. Warren spoke with excitement, proposing that instead of waiting, they should turn the situation around and invade Dorson. In his view, Caednia must already be trembling under Dorson's threat, and he wanted the Red Knights to take the lead in the attack. Hearing this, King Mars felt confused. Mars turned to Gamras and asked whether he opposed the idea of war. Gamera's responded with admiration, interpreting the situation as something that perfectly aligned with the debut of their monster army. To him, everything appeared to be unfolding exactly as King Mars had planned. Mars struggled to follow the reasoning behind their reactions. In truth, he did not want a war at all. For him, peace was always the better option. He then addressed the situation by stating that they should not act recklessly. Rushing forward without thought would accomplish nothing. Two people immediately agreed, emphasizing that everything required proper preparation. Mars quietly wondered whether they were all even speaking about the same thing. Outside the castle, Agma welcomed the arrival of his elite warriors with visible satisfaction. He brought up Dorsen's demand that Caednia be handed over and questioned whether they could really allow such an insult to pass. In his words, simply watching Caednia be taken away was unacceptable. The gathered warriors responded together with a firm rejection. They shouted that they would crush Dorsen's thieves and make them bleed for the insult. From the castle window, King Mars watched the scene with growing concern. His men had assembled without even consulting him first, and now they were portraying Dorsen as the villain. Mars quietly wondered whether giving speeches inside the castle grounds without permission could itself be considered an act of aggression. Agma continued speaking, pointing out that Dorsen's army was formidable. Their soldiers were well trained and fully equipped. He explained that Dorsen's forces were expected to outnumber them 5-1. Some of the men reacted with surprise. Agma immediately reframed the situation, declaring that this simply meant each of them needed to kill 5 enemies. From his perspective, the problem was straightforward. Watching from above, Mars could hardly believe the reasoning. To him, it seemed as though Agma was treating war like a simple arithmetic problem. Agma then challenged the members of the 100, questioning whether any of them were incapable of handling 5 opponents. Declaring himself the strongest among them, he proclaimed that as the 100's number 1 he would personally bring back 50 heads as an offering to King Zeros. Listening to this declaration, King Mars felt increasingly frustrated. None of this was what he wanted. Nevertheless, the other members of the 100 responded with growing excitement. They shouted that they would bring back 10 heads, 20, even 30, each promising to deliver the heads of Dorsen's army to King Zeros. King Mars quietly concealed the fear rising inside him as he watched the situation unfold. In his thoughts, he felt as though the value of life was crumbling before his eyes. He could not help wondering what he was even supposed to do with a mountain of severed heads. Turning toward Gamaras, Mars suggested that surely the people would not want a war either. Gamaras calmly explained that the opposite seemed to be true and that the people were fully supportive. Elsewhere, in Caednia, voices among the population called for punishment against Dorsen's arrogance. Many believed the 100 should demonstrate their strength, and some even spoke about spreading the name of Zeros across the continent. Hearing these sentiments, King Mars realized that there was no path left for escape. During the council discussing the war against Dorsen, the participants displayed clear enthusiasm for the coming conflict. Mars maintained a faint smile while quietly acknowledging that there was no realistic way to avoid the war anymore. Accepting the situation, he finally declared that they would proceed with the war. Sometime later, Mars went to inspect the monster mass production project. The program operated under the supervision of a mage serving directly under Frau. Until now, Mars had largely ignored it, but with war approaching he felt it was necessary to see it himself. A mage approached and introduced herself as Keely, a researcher who served under Lady Frau and specialized in the study of monsters. Mars mentioned that he had heard she came from the mage nation of Kiel and asked why she had come to Falun. Keely explained that while Kiel was devoted to magic, it had what she considered a fatal flaw. In her view, the nation refused to recognize the true value of monster research. She regarded small sacrifices and collateral damage as a natural part of progress, yet the authorities in Kiel had exiled her because of what she described as a minor mishap. Mars responded with a quiet smile while drawing his own conclusion. In his mind, it was obvious that Keely had created some kind of unstable monster, which had gone berserk and caused several deaths. The realization made him see Keely as a walking liability. Mars then glanced toward Frau standing beside him. She simply waved at him. Despite his concerns, Mars decided that he might as well listen further. He asked Keely about the current state of the monster project. Keely answered with enthusiasm, saying that everything was progressing well. Creating such a creature had always been her dream. In Kiel, that dream had been forbidden, but in Falun she was free to pursue it without restriction, so she had devoted herself entirely to the work. Mars listened while thinking privately that Keely's dream involved building a monster army. It made perfect sense to him that Kiel had expelled her. At the same time, he reflected that he had never actually told her to do whatever she pleased. Still, considering that monsters were already being used for war, food, and entertainment in Falun, the situation seemed to fit the reputation people had begun attaching to him as the king of Falun. Keely then mentioned the rumors she had heard about King Zeros. According to those stories, he had taken the throne with a band of outlaws, crushed anyone who resisted him, and now ruled without restraint or moral limitation. Hearing this, Mars felt genuine disbelief. In his mind, he had not realized that his reputation had deteriorated to such an extent. King Mars reflected that the rumors about him made him sound like a complete villain. Keely, however, did not see it that way. In her view, he had become something of a legend within the mage community. She had even heard stories claiming that King Mars allowed human experimentation for the sake of magical advancement. In that world, the principle of placing magic before life had earned him admiration. Because of this reputation, Falun had gradually become a refuge for brilliant mages who had been exiled from other nations for their controversial research. Mars listened while thinking quietly that those people had been expelled for unethical experiments. He wondered why they were now gathering in Falun. At the same time, he noted privately that the human experiments were actually something Frau conducted, not him. Keely continued by explaining that their progress with monster farming was also advancing. Even the nearly extinct killer rabbits had quickly recovered once they were protected from the members of the 100. According to Keely, monsters had begun fleeing at the sight of humans, which she considered an astonishing development. Mars then asked about the monster army itself, and Keely pointed toward its location. When Mars looked in that direction, he was stunned by what he saw. There were 10 enormous creatures standing there. Keely explained that they had been fed monster meat. Monsters naturally preyed on each other, but feeding them rare, high-grade meat had accelerated their growth dramatically. The remains from the earlier monster stampede had proven especially useful, and she had enhanced the process further with special potions that greatly boosted their abilities. Mars noted that there were only about 100 of them and wondered if that number was too small for a war. Keely explained that these were only the core units. The trained ones had already been released into the demon beast forest, roaming freely. The alpha beast expanded its territory every day, while its war-wolf pack reproduced naturally. She even described them as surprisingly kind and cute. Keely also mentioned that the alpha still obeyed only King Zeros. Hearing this left Mars bewildered. He could not understand why a war-wolf would obey him. Keely reminded him of something that had happened about a year earlier. At that time, Mars had brought back a war-wolf that was trembling in fear and deeply scarred. She asked whether he had beaten the creature nearly to death back then. Mars remained silent while thinking that he might indeed have done so. Keely explained that the beast now viewed him as the apex predator. According to her, simply threatening to call Lord Zeros was enough to make it obey immediately. From her perspective, the domestication process had gone surprisingly smoothly. She added that the creature Mars had brought back was a high-tier alpha. Because of that, they now had roughly 1,300 war-wolves under control, meaning the army was already more than prepared. Mars quietly considered everything he had heard. Something about the situation still felt slightly off to him. Even so, the preparations meant they were ready to face Dorsen's army. It would be Falun's first full-scale war under his rule. The battle was approaching quickly, and in truth, King Mars did not want any part of it. On the Brix Plains in northern Cadnia, the invading army of Dorsen advanced while the combined forces of Falun and Cadnia moved to confront them. The clash that would later be remembered as the Battle of Brix began at that moment. High above the battlefield, the mages of Dorsen released their magic into the sky. Their spells collided with the magic cast by Falun's mages, filling the air with clashing bursts of power. One of the Dorsen mages reported to General Kinbry that Falun's magical strength was greater than expected and questioned whether they should return fire with full force. General Kinbry remained calm and dismissed the concern. In his view, Falun had perhaps only 2,000 soldiers, while Dorsen commanded 10,000. Their army held a clear advantage of 5-1. Kinbry reflected on the situation with confidence. His troops had been trained specifically for tactics that relied on overwhelming numbers, and they were prepared for this kind of battle. Even so, one concern remained in his mind. The current queen of Falun, Frau, known as the Thunder Empress, had been a prodigy since childhood. That gifted mage possessed the ability to unleash a single strike powerful enough to change the entire course of the battlefield. To counter that threat, Dorsen's mage corps would maintain their magical barriers without pause. Their plan was to exhaust the Falun mages by forcing them to continually spend mana. Once Falun's magic was drained, Dorsen's superior numbers would overwhelm them. Yet there was another concern that Kinbry could not ignore. King Zeros of Falun. He had taken the throne through force, and within Falun's arena he was said to be unmatched. During the monster stampede in Cadnia, his name had spread rapidly across the land. Kinbry considered the possibility that the blood of an ancient hero ran strongly in King Zeros. A hero blessed by the gods could wield power beyond the limits of ordinary humans. Even so, Dorsen possessed its own hidden advantages. Nearby, a soldier reported that Falun's magical barrage had suddenly ceased. According to the report, the moment had come to deploy the knights. At once, the knights of Dorsen surged forward and collided with Falun's forces. As the battle unfolded, General Kinbry observed that Falun's soldiers were remarkably resilient. Even when faced with many enemies at once, they did not break. Still, Kinbry had expected that level of resistance. 2,000 soldiers from Falun were now engaged against half of Dorsen's blades. The exchange was more than enough to occupy them. Meanwhile, Dorsen still held 8,000 fresh troops against Falun's remaining 1,000. No matter how strong each Falun soldier might be individually, Kinbry believed they could not overcome such a difference in numbers. In the end, war was decided by numbers. Victory, in his mind, was already his. From his position overlooking the battlefield, King Zeros observed the fighting. He could clearly see how disciplined Dorsen soldiers were. Their formations were precise, and they constantly forced their opponents into 2-against-1 or even 3-against-1 engagements. Agma approached King Zeros and reported that the lower ranks were nearing their limit against the Dorsen forces. Zeros reflected quietly with appreciation for Agma and the others who had been holding the line. Even the lower-ranked members of the 100, those outside the top 10, were now experiencing their first real battlefield. If the highest-ranked fighters had unleashed their full strength from the beginning, the lower ranks would never have had the chance to fight. Zeros understood that fighting monsters was not the same as fighting people. The same difference existed between arena duels and actual warfare. No one could know when the next war would come, so it was better for the soldiers to become familiar with group combat now. Because of that, Red Knight Commander Warren, Black Knight Commander Chrome, and even Frau herself had been asked to restrain their attacks. The second unit had been given the opportunity to fight through the difficult battle. Zeros quietly hoped that Dorsen's army would grow tired and retreat, since excessive damage would only create lasting grudges. Agma then asked whether it was time to deploy the upper ranks. Zeros agreed and instructed him to replace the fighters gradually. Meanwhile, the Dorsen knights believed they had gained the advantage and began pressing forward, attempting to force Falun's soldiers back. Then suddenly a massive figure appeared behind them. The giant warrior swung his weapon with tremendous force, striking the knights and scattering them through the air. The man was recognized as Wanfu. In battle, Wanfu fought with the strength of 100 men. He had once been a lumberjack known for his raw physical power. His personal motto was simple: never block an attack, always dodge it. Within the 100, Wanfu held the rank of 30th, yet his overwhelming strength made him a terrifying fighter. His weapon was known as the Blood Rod, a gift from King Mars. It had been forged from a massive tree belonging to a rare subspecies. The material was far too difficult to shape and far too heavy for most warriors to wield. But Wanfu had never been concerned with such difficulties. To the Knights of Dorsen, the sight of him was shocking. Some even wondered whether he was truly human or some kind of monster. Inside the command tent, a Dorsen officer rushed to report that their lines were beginning to fall back. General Kinbry reacted with disbelief. With 5 times the numbers on their side, such a reversal should have been impossible. The course of the battle should not have changed so easily. Kinbry then considered a troubling possibility. Perhaps King Zeros himself had entered the battlefield. A knight reported that several elite fighters from the enemy had joined the battlefield, though King Zeros himself had not appeared. Even so, Falun's forces were overwhelming their squads. The 3-man tactical formations that Dorsen relied on were no longer effective, and their soldiers were being crushed. General Kinbry concluded that if Zeros had not personally entered the fight, then the attackers must be high-ranking members of the 100. He considered whether it would be wiser to pull their forces back. In his thoughts, Kinbry recognized how fierce Falun's momentum had become. A retreat at the wrong moment could cause the entire army to collapse. Yet continuing the fight also risked the possibility of their lines breaking completely. He weighed his options carefully, unsure which course would be the right move. At that moment, a voice requested permission to enter the battle. Kinbry acknowledged the 2 warriors who had stepped forward. They were among Dorsen's most powerful fighters, reserves meant to face Zeros himself if necessary. They were known as Knights of the 5 Thrones, Mateus and Dond. Mateus expressed his desire to fight, having waited long enough. Kinbry allowed them to proceed but instructed them only to buy time so that the main force could withdraw safely. Elsewhere on the battlefield, Wanfu reflected on his past in Falun's arena, where victory had always eluded him. Now, standing on a real battlefield, he intended to prove his strength. Before Falun's highest ranks arrived, he believed he could crush their enemies. Mateus soon approached and noted Wanfu's enormous size. Wanfu immediately swung the blood rod with tremendous force. To his shock, Mateus dodged the attack with ease. Wanfu demanded to know his opponent's identity. Mateus introduced himself as one of the 5 Thrones. Wanfu recognized the title as belonging to Dorsen's 5 strongest warriors and found the encounter intriguing. In response, Wanfu declared his own name and identified himself as a member of the 100, stating his intention to defeat him. Then, without warning, blood burst from Wanfu's head, and he collapsed to the ground. Mateus observed the fallen warrior and considered that he could end the fight then and there. However, his task was only to stall the enemy. He then ordered the Dorson Knights to withdraw, stating that their mission was complete and that the retreat had been commanded by General Kinbry. Before leaving, Matthias turned his attention toward King Zeros and regarded the outcome as a draw. Not long after, Ogma noticed that Dorson's army was pulling back and asked whether they should pursue the retreating enemy. King Mars decided against it and instructed them to treat the wounded instead. In his thoughts, Mars evaluated the situation. Dorson's forces had been reduced significantly, but the losses were not catastrophic. His own soldiers had gained valuable experience in real combat, and that alone was worthwhile. For Mars, ending the war without creating deeper grudges was the best possible outcome. That night, inside the encampment, Ogma expressed his frustration. He felt that he had already reached his limit from holding back. Chrome dismissed the complaint, remarking that the real fighting had not even begun. Ogma reacted with anger, unable to accept that idea. In his view, standing back and issuing orders while others fought did not suit him at all. Turning toward Chrome, Ogma pointed out that Chrome had already drawn his sword during the battle. To Ogma, Chrome's expression clearly showed a desire to kill the enemy, which had made the entire squad uneasy. Warren then suggested that the following day they should fight seriously without holding back. Chrome agreed, explaining that the plan of letting the lower ranks gain experience had only been intended for the first day of battle. Ogma immediately declared that he would be the first to fight when the next day began. Elsewhere, Frau informed Mars that her patience had reached its limit. By the next day, she intended to unleash the full extent of her magic and was already anticipating the moment. Inside the Dorson encampment, General Kinbry considered the situation carefully and wondered what their next move should be. He had never believed the 100 could be defeated with a single decisive strike. Because of that, he had prepared for many different possibilities. He had avoided overconfidence, yet even with those precautions their main force had already taken significant damage. In his thoughts, he questioned just how powerful Falun's army truly was. A report soon arrived stating that a supply unit heading toward their position had been ambushed and completely wiped out. Kinbry struggled to believe it. That route passed through lands controlled by Cadenian nobles who had allied themselves with Dorson. For a moment he wondered whether those nobles had betrayed them. The knight delivering the report denied that possibility and added that the attackers were not human forces. According to the survivors' accounts, the unit had been overwhelmed by a massive horde of monsters. Kinbry reacted with disbelief and demanded confirmation that the information was reliable. In the southern regions such a horde might have been possible, but in northern Cadenia there should not have been a monster swarm of that size. Gradually, a troubling idea formed in his mind. The incident might be connected to Mars of Falun. The ambush itself had unfolded earlier when the supply unit advanced along the road. Hidden nearby, Keely commanded a large group of monsters and ordered them to remain still until the target came within range. Once the moment arrived, she gave the command to attack. The horde surged forward immediately. The knights escorting the supplies were overwhelmed by the terrifying sight as the monsters descended upon them. Within moments, the creatures tore the soldiers apart. Watching the scene from a distance, Keely calmly observed the carnage. In her mind, she noted that more than 500 monsters were under her control and that their coordination was excellent. To her, the creatures were almost like pets. She allowed them to consume everything and encouraged them to leave nothing behind. Back in the present at Dorson's encampment, one of the officials insisted that such a report was impossible. In his view, no human could control that many monsters. General Kinbry responded that they had to assume the worst possibility. Reflecting on both the earlier stampede and the current ambush, he noticed a disturbing pattern. The monsters always seemed to move in ways that benefited Falun. With the supply units destroyed, Dorson's operations would be severely crippled. Kinbry therefore decided that retreat was the most reasonable option while they still had the strength to withdraw. He ordered preparations for a full retreat beginning at dawn. The following morning, however, urgent news arrived. A soldier rushed to inform the general that Falun's forces were advancing. Kinbry was taken by surprise. The messenger added that even with their supply lines cut, Dorson still greatly outnumbered the enemy. Yet the Falun army was moving forward with King Mars himself leading the charge. Meanwhile, Mars reflected quietly that he had never expected the situation to reach this point. The previous night, Ogma had announced that Dorson's forces were already preparing to flee. In his view, this was the perfect opportunity to carve King Mars's fearsome reputation into their enemies so deeply that they would never challenge Falun again. To Ogma, the moment had arrived for King Mars to personally take the battlefield. King Mars reflected silently on the situation. They had come so close to ending the war without creating lasting resentment. That had been the reason he allowed Keely to attack the enemy supply unit. Fortunately, no one had seen her involvement. In his mind, problems should be solved without relying on force whenever possible. Avoiding further fighting had always been his goal. Mars stated that he did not intend to lead the charge himself. Warren interpreted the decision differently. He believed that Mars had restrained himself the previous day so that the lower-ranked members of the 100 could gain real combat experience. Now, in Warren's view, there was no longer any need for the king to hold back. Mars quietly realized that Warren completely misunderstood him. Chrome added that unlike the comfortable and sheltered royals of other nations, King Mars always led from the front. To Chrome, that was the true image of a king. Mars could not help thinking that there was no real reason for a king to stand on the front lines. In his mind, he wondered when such a practice had ever become a legitimate strategy. Despite his doubts, the members of the 100 enthusiastically chanted King Mars's name. Back in the present, the forces of the 100, advancing under King Mars, were tearing through the army of Dorson. General Kinbry watched the situation unfold with growing unease. He could not understand why Falun had chosen this moment to attack. Even with their supply lines disrupted, Dorson still possessed a clear numerical advantage. Suddenly, one of Dorson's officials shouted a warning while looking toward the sky. The sight above them filled him with fear. High overhead appeared the figure known as the Thunder Empress. Frau began chanting a powerful incantation, calling upon the forces of thunder and lightning. As her words echoed across the battlefield, the mages of Dorson immediately recognized the danger. They hurried to raise their magical barriers and took cover. Frau continued her chant, invoking countless bolts of lightning as if summoning divine judgment itself. This spell was the ultimate strike that had earned her the title of Thunder Empress. Moments later, she unleashed her magic. A massive lightning strike crashed down upon the Dorson army, followed by a devastating explosion that shook the battlefield. One of Dorson's officials realized that the previous day Frau had not used anything nearly as powerful. She had clearly been conserving her strength. Although their magical barriers had held during the earlier fighting, maintaining those defenses for an entire day had drained their mage core. Now their wards no longer possessed the strength to withstand such an attack. At that moment, General Kinbry finally understood King Mars's strategy. Mars had waited patiently for the moment when Dorson's defenses were weakest before sending in his elite forces. Kinbry immediately called for Matthias and Dante. He ordered them to take his personal knights and intercept Falun's advance. Their mission was clear. They were to confront Falun head-on and bring down King Mars. Soon afterward, Matthias and Dante encountered King Mars on the battlefield. The two warriors stepped forward and introduced themselves, while Mars also revealed his identity to them. Mars then declared that he would personally face the warriors of the 5 thrones and instructed Agma to handle the rest of the enemy forces. Agma accepted the order without hesitation. Matthias reacted with confidence, noting that Mars intended to face both him and Dante alone. To Matthias, that decision sounded like arrogance, and he prepared himself for the fight. Without hesitation, Matthias launched forward with incredible speed. His movements were almost impossible to follow as he delivered a rapid series of strikes. Mars immediately recognized that Matthias was swinging his blade far more times than expected within a single moment. In response, Mars delivered a powerful kick that forced Matthias back. From that brief exchange, Mars understood that Matthias was a swordsman who relied on extreme speed. At the same time, Dante attacked from behind. Mars quickly blocked the strike and realized that Dante's style was completely different. Dante relied on overwhelming power rather than speed. Mars even noted with surprise that Dante possessed such strength despite not having eaten monster meat. Mars then created an invisible shield around himself, leaving the two opponents momentarily unsure of what they were facing. Afterward, Mars calmly removed the gravity armlet he had been wearing. He then asked whether the two of them had any intention of surrendering. Matthias rejected the idea and suggested that deflecting Dante's strike with an unusual trick did not mean Mars had already won. In Matthias's mind, the fight still remained 2 against 1. Mars replied that he would no longer restrain himself and warned them that they would die if they continued. With that, Mars removed the gravity armlet that Frau had given him. Without the burden of 5 times gravity weighing down his body, his movements suddenly became far lighter and faster. Matthias reacted with frustration, questioning whether Mars had not been fighting seriously until that moment. Even so, he charged forward again, determined to continue the battle without surrender. The next instant Mars struck. With a single powerful blow, blood burst from Matthias's body, and he collapsed, lifeless. Dante attempted to attack as well, but before he could complete his strike, Mars cut him down. Dante's body was split in 2 before he even had the chance to respond. The members of the 100 erupted in cheers for King Mars. Across the battlefield, the Knights of Dorson witnessed the fall of the 5 thrones with disbelief. Elsewhere, Warren and Chrome continued cutting through Dorson's army. Seeing the battle turning hopeless, General Kinbry ordered his soldiers to flee and scatter in every direction without looking back. In his mind, saving as many lives as possible was the only remaining option so that they could fight again another day. However, as the retreat began, Agma suddenly appeared. With a powerful strike, he killed Kinbry before the general could escape. After the battle ended, the king of Dorson received the report of the defeat. The news described it as a crushing loss. Nearly 70% of their forces had been destroyed, and continuing the war was no longer possible. Faced with such devastation, the king decided that they would seek peace. At that moment, an unfamiliar girl stepped forward and addressed the king. She declared that there was no need to pursue peace because she would personally kill King Mars. The girl carried an overwhelming presence around her. The question remained just how powerful she truly was. Carmilla decided that they would soon be entering Falun, having heard that people there consumed what was called monster meat, and she sought confirmation about it. The man accompanying her affirmed it, explaining that it was believed to grant demonic power, a notion that Carmilla regarded as absurd. She held firmly to the belief that true strength could only be gained through proper discipline. With that conviction, she set her sights ahead, intending to show those she considered uncivilized what she saw as noble power. Meanwhile, at the royal castle's training yard, Yamato was sparring with King Mars. Yamato moved forward and executed the Mirage Sword technique. King Mars observed that the attack was fast, but he noted that defense required more precise and minimal movements than offense. Any opening, no matter how small, could easily be taken advantage of. Yamato admired King Mars' skill, recognizing how every attack had been blocked, just as expected. King Mars reacted with a sense of impressed disbelief, reflecting on how Yamato had truly replicated the Mirage Sword, a technique once used by Mateus of Dorson's 5 Thrones during the recent battle. After King Mars defeated 2 members of Dorson's 5 Thrones, figures regarded as symbols of martial supremacy, Dorson lost the will to continue fighting. Their interception unit was crushed, and as their retreating forces were pursued by hundred, most of their troops were wiped out. Recalling the events from that battle, King Mars had instructed Ogma to hold back, recognizing that continuing the assault would lead to the complete annihilation of Dorson's army. Ogma acknowledged the reasoning. Ogma then considered allowing a few survivors to escape, thinking it would leave witnesses to spread the fear associated with King Zeros. King Mars found that reasoning misplaced. He then gave the command to halt the pursuit. Although the attack had been more intense than originally intended, it was clear that Dorson would no longer be quick to provoke Falun again. Returning to the present, King Mars noted that Yamato had not only replicated Matea's swordsmanship but had also learned Dante's Earthbreak technique, which Yamato confirmed. Yamato held the position of Hundred's 4th rank, and he explained that once he grasped the underlying principle of a technique, he was able to reproduce it. King Mars acknowledged this ability, recognizing that mastering a technique after seeing it only once could only be described as genius. Yamato dismissed the praise, expressing that he was not deserving of such recognition. He bowed deeply in respect, acknowledging that without the power granted to him by King Mars, he would never have reached such a level within his lifetime. Yamato had not been especially gifted in terms of physical ability from the start. He pushed himself by consuming excessive amounts of monster meat, forcing his body to grow stronger while repeatedly breaking it down in the process. Through that harsh cycle, he managed to master high-level sword techniques. His fixation on the blade was undeniable. He even succeeded in reproducing the sonic blade, a technique usually reserved only for the elite ranks of the 100. Because of that, King Mars entrusted him with the task during the war to observe the battles of the 5 Thrones. However, as events unfolded, the war eventually settled, and the situation grew quiet. King Mars wished for that peace to continue. At the castle gate, a visitor arrived and was stopped by the guards, who questioned her identity and the reason for her presence. Carmilla responded with confidence, believing her reputation should already be known, and questioned whether the guards truly failed to recognize her. The guards proceeded to ask who she had an appointment with, stating that it needed to be confirmed. Carmilla made it clear that she had no scheduled audience and had simply come on a whim to visit King Zeros. She then revealed her name and identified herself as being from the Dorson Kingdom, one of the 5 Thrones. One guard mocked her attire, while the other told her to leave. Carmilla found their attitude stiff and unrefined. Without hesitation, she cast a wind spell that sent the guards flying and forced the gate open. Reinforcements quickly arrived, demanding her identity and attempting to prevent her from advancing. With a single motion, Carmilla struck down one of the guards. The others reacted in alarm, recognizing the technique as Sonic Blade. She had not even drawn a weapon, releasing the attack with nothing more than a flick of her fingers. Finding the remaining guard's reaction irritating, she silenced him and ended his life. After that, she eliminated all the reinforcements, remarking on how easily they fell, as if they were no more than paper. In her view, Falun's knights lacked strength. Then a voice ordered her to stop. The speaker was Bled, captain of the Blue Knight Corps, who demanded to know her identity. Carmilla regarded the situation as another annoyance. She stated her name and revealed that she was the 3rd of Dorson's 5 Thrones. She then instructed Bled to cease any feudal resistance and clear the path, making it clear that her purpose there was to meet King Zeros. Bled quickly understood that she was no ordinary opponent, recognizing her as a top-tier fighter. Holding the 10th rank within the 100, he carried himself with confidence, making it clear through his stance that he would not be taken down easily. Carmilla looked at him with clear disdain, unimpressed by his composure. Without hesitation, she prepared and released a sonic blade. Bled reacted instantly, raising his defense and blocking the attack. That result caught Carmilla's attention. She saw him as more capable than expected and noted the shield he was using, identifying it as mithril. Bled, on the other hand, recognized the technique she used and understood how unusual it was to release such a powerful attack with almost no wind-up. He held firm, relying on the shield entrusted to him by King Mars, an item discovered in the Demon Beast Forest and passed on as something he took pride in. Carmilla found the shield irritating and immediately launched another sonic blade. Once again, Bled blocked it without hesitation. She grew tired of the exchange, seeing his constant defense as tedious. From her perspective, relying only on defense would never lead to victory. Bled was fully aware of that and did not intend to remain passive. With sudden force, he surged forward and unleashed a shield bash. Carmilla avoided it with precision, but even from the near miss, she could tell the sheer pressure behind the attack was enough to cut through skin. The attack did not land, yet Bled did not stop. He pressed forward again, charging at her with the same overwhelming force. Carmilla used the surrounding wall to shift her movement, bouncing off it to evade him once more. As she observed his attack, she noticed something unusual. Despite the impact, the wall remained intact. It became clear to her that Bled was controlling his movement, likely using mana as a form of braking. His fighting style was built on pure weight and speed, delivering brutal force. A direct hit would have crushed her without question. But without making contact, all that power meant nothing. Bled's frustration grew as his attacks continued to miss. Carmilla, unimpressed, mocked his efforts, pointing out the lack of effectiveness in his straightforward approach. She found his movements lacking and, with growing disinterest, saw the fight as no longer engaging. Carmilla closed the distance and stood directly in front of Bled, studying him at close range. She regarded him as earnest and decent, yet at the same time found him uninteresting and lacking, mocking the idea that no one had ever pointed that out to him. Before Bled could properly react, she vanished from his sight and appeared behind him. From there, she noted his inexperience in more ways than one. In that instant, Bled realized the danger he was in, but it was already too late. Carmilla struck from behind, driving her attack into him. The blow landed, and Bled was wounded, yet he managed to step back instead of collapsing. That reaction caught Carmilla off guard. She quickly understood that the strike had not been as decisive as intended and noted that she should have severed his spine. She commented on his stubbornness, pointing out how unusual it was for him to still be standing after such an attack. Bled, despite the injury, remained firm, showing no sign of giving in so easily. Carmilla then brought up the men she had struck down on her way to the castle, assuming they were already dead. Bled made it clear through his stance and composure that they had not fallen, showing confidence in the resilience of his comrades. To him, such damage was not enough to take down members of the 100. Their training was far harsher, and if attacks of that level were fatal, they would have been wiped out long ago. Carmilla's expression shifted slightly as she processed that. Under normal circumstances, Bled should have already been finished. The idea that they could endure something like that reminded her of how they consumed dangerous substances and survived, a level of toughness she associated with something crude and savage. It became clear to her that if Bled did not fall as expected, the situation could become troublesome. Bled stood his ground, viewing her confidence as nothing more than bravado, something he believed he fully understood. Carmilla dismissed his resistance, seeing their efforts as nothing more than a meaningless delay. Then an interruption came. An unseen force suddenly struck toward her, forcing her to react instantly. Carmilla narrowly avoided the attack, recognizing that if it had connected, her body would have been torn apart. At that moment, Yamato appeared at the battlefield. His presence marked a shift, as he had arrived after the Blue Knight Corps had held the line long enough for him to get there. Carmilla sensed the strength behind him and questioned the nature of his presence. Yamato stepped forward calmly, presenting himself as the 4th rank of the 100 and a swordsmanship instructor of Falun. His arrival signaled the beginning of a new phase in the battle, as he prepared himself for the confrontation ahead. Bled was taken aback by the sudden arrival of his sensei. The shift in the battlefield was immediate, and Carmilla, having narrowly avoided the earlier strike, reflected on how close she had been to being completely torn apart. She turned her attention to Yamato, trying to gauge the kind of opponent now standing before her. She noted his role as a sword instructor, yet from her perspective, his appearance did not seem particularly imposing. At the same time, she realized she had not formally introduced herself, though that thought was quickly interrupted. Yamato already understood who she was. He confirmed her identity as Carmilla, addressing her with certainty. Carmilla responded with a faint smile, recognizing that Yamato appeared more informed and perceptive than the others she had encountered so far. Yamato acknowledged her reputation, identifying her as the Mad Princess of Dorson, a title he had heard frequently. Upon hearing that name, Carmilla's expression shifted, the earlier hint of amusement fading. She found the nickname deeply disrespectful. Yamato continued, laying out the background behind it. He recalled how her brother had taken the throne, resulting in her losing her royal standing and being placed among the 5 heavenly ranks. From his time running a dojo, he had often heard discussions about powerful individuals, and her name had come up more than once. She had been expected to uphold the dignity of the royal family, yet instead acted freely, using her strength without restraint. Those who displeased her were eliminated without hesitation, and over time, that behavior led to the name she was now known by. He went further, pointing out how her reputation had become so severe that no one was willing to marry her. In the end, it was said that the king had little choice but to assign her to the 5 heavenly ranks. Carmilla remained silent as she listened, taking in each remark without interruption. Yamato did not stop there. He added that she had rejected both mage training and knight training, leaving her unable to properly use magic and unwilling to master swordsmanship. Despite that, she still referred to herself as a magic swordsman, even though she lacked full proficiency in either. Bled, hearing all of this unfold, found himself unsure of how to respond, caught off guard by the bluntness of Yamato's words. Yamato continued with a light, almost amused tone, pointing out that despite everything said about her, her strength was undeniable, and that was precisely why no one could deal with her. That, in itself, had become her reputation. As those words settled in, Carmilla's irritation steadily grew. Yamato then casually questioned what was wrong, implying she might be feeling cold. Bled, observing her expression, concluded that she was more likely angered. Carmilla's face turned completely serious, her intent clear as she resolved to eliminate him. Bled felt a sense of unease from her presence, while Yamato remained calm, showing no sign of concern. Without warning, Carmilla unleashed a sonic blade, directing the attack straight at Yamato. Yamato recognized the technique immediately, noting how it was heavily inclined toward magic. He observed the unusual nature of it, questioning how the sound waves were produced from something as simple as a snap of the fingers and then amplified through magic. As the attack reached him, he cut through it cleanly with his sword, dispersing it. Carmilla was visibly caught off guard by that outcome. Yamato continued to analyze her technique, pointing out that for achieving pure power, a proper incantation would have been more effective. From his perspective, the method she used only resulted in wasted magical energy. He further criticized it as a style that relied too much on raw talent, lacking refinement. Carmilla reacted sharply to that assessment, her frustration becoming more apparent. She launched another attack, this time with greater force, tearing into the ground itself. Yamato avoided it without difficulty. Carmilla's anger intensified, as she realized no one had ever spoken to her in such a manner before. That alone solidified her intent to eliminate him completely. Yamato, still composed, compared her attack to the technique known as Earth Break. He remarked that if the Blue Knight Corps had been struck by something of that level, it would explain why they had been overwhelmed so quickly. Bled, hearing that, reflected that the attacks they faced earlier had not been quite as destructive as what was now being displayed. Carmilla, now clearly irritated, focused on the title that had been used against her, unable to recall ever hearing such a name before. The idea of being labeled in that way did not sit well with her. Yamato made it clear through his response that the name did not originate from him, but rather from the general opinion of others. That explanation only made it worse in Carmilla's eyes. Deciding she would no longer restrain herself, Carmilla shifted her stance. Her sword began to glow, a bright light gathering around the blade as she prepared something more serious. Yamato immediately recognized the technique. It matched the rumored magic sword, a weapon formed entirely from magic, used in place of a physical blade. At the same time, Carmilla's eyes changed. Her pupils took on an unusual form, something far from ordinary. Yamato observed further and understood that she was using incantations inscribed on her fan, turning it into a substitute for a staff to enhance her casting. Then, without warning, Yamato felt a strange shift in his body. A sudden heaviness weighed him down, catching him off guard. He quickly realized what it could be, identifying it as a magic eye. Carmilla acknowledged his observation, recognizing that he had pushed her far enough to use it. Yamato analyzed the effect, concluding that it was related to gravity. The pressure felt roughly doubled as he endured it. Carmilla understood the impact of her ability. Even if it seemed modest, it was lethal against a swordsman. Only the leader of the 5 heavenly ranks had managed to survive it before. With that advantage, she advanced forward, closing the distance with the intent to finish the fight. As she moved in, Yamato reacted at the last moment, snapping into action and intercepting her attack. The clash was immediate, and Carmilla was left stunned by the fact that he had managed to block it under such conditions. She pulled back slightly, reassessing him after that unexpected outcome. Yamato reacted with mild curiosity when the strike failed to land, noting the outcome as if testing a possibility. Carmilla, clearly unsettled, could not understand how he was still able to move despite being under the effect of her magic eye. As she observed more closely, she came to a realization. She identified his movement as something brilliant, a combination of illusion-based techniques and swordsmanship footwork that created the impression of teleportation. From her perspective, it made him seem more like a mage than anything else. Yamato clarified through his stance and response that the technique leaned more toward the movements of a swordsman. Carmilla found that difficult to accept. To her, the explanation did not resolve the main issue. What troubled her more was the fact that her magic eye, which should have slowed him down significantly, appeared to have little effect. Yamato then revealed the reason. He had removed the bracelet he was wearing. That statement left Carmilla confused. She did not immediately understand what kind of bracelet could make such a difference. Yamato explained that it was a prisoner's bracelet, a device that subjected the wearer's body to double the force of gravity. Hearing that made Carmilla uneasy. The idea that it was something associated with prisoners raised more questions, especially when it became clear that Yamato had been wearing it by choice. She questioned the logic of someone using such a restriction regularly. Yamato viewed it differently. To him, it was simply a way to continue training even in everyday life. Among the higher ranks of the 100, this practice was not unusual. He went further, noting that King Zeros himself wore a bracelet with an even stronger effect, something he saw as proof of the king's overwhelming strength. Carmilla could not help but think that such behavior bordered on madness. From her perspective, there was something fundamentally wrong with choosing to live under those conditions. Yamato did not deny that possibility, but for him, that way of living defined their pursuit. Everything revolved around power, and King Zeros stood at the very peak of it. In comparison, someone at Carmilla's level would not be able to match him. At the same time, King Zeros was not present in that moment. That realization struck Carmilla, forcing her to reassess the situation. At that point, Bled spoke up with clear frustration. He questioned Yamato's actions, unable to understand why he had stepped in to block the path instead of allowing the intruder to be driven back. From Bled's perspective as a knight, permitting an enemy to advance went against their duty, and resisting them was the natural course of action. Carmilla fell silent for a moment, then came to the conclusion that the situation felt pointless. With that thought, she decided that it would be better to simply leave and return home. Yamato did not allow that. He made it clear through his presence that she would not be leaving so easily. Carmilla's expression tightened as she looked toward him, sensing the shift in intent. Yamato explained the circumstances behind his actions. He had been given orders by Prime Minister Gamaras to capture her. Because she was of royal standing, killing her would create complications, so he had been instructed to take her alive. That was the situation he was operating under. However, as he observed her movements during the fight, even he found them unusual. Attacks that should have connected were slipping through, which he recognized as something strange. Beyond his orders, Yamato also made his own decision. Regardless of the command, he had no intention of letting her leave. With that resolve, he moved forward, closing the distance to engage her directly. Carmilla steadied herself with confidence. The idea of being captured alive made her feel underestimated, especially since she had not taken any real damage so far. However, as Yamato advanced, a rapid series of attacks came toward her. Her eyes widened as she reacted to the sudden pressure. Yamato began to piece things together. He realized that Carmilla's dress was not ordinary. It interfered with visual perception and even masked the sound of her footsteps. That lingering sense of unease he had felt throughout the fight started to make sense. The shoes she wore were also magical tools, likely affecting balance and disrupting spatial awareness. Combined, the dress and shoes distorted depth perception, making it difficult to accurately track her movements. Carmilla, observing him in return, began to question what kind of person he was. The longer the fight continued, the more her strategies were being uncovered. She reflected on how exposing such details could be seen as lacking tact, yet she remained confident. Even if he understood the mechanics behind her abilities, overcoming them would not be simple. It would require fighting without relying on sight at all. Yamato responded through his composure, showing that such a condition would not stop him. He made it clear that he was capable of fighting without depending on his eyes or even his hearing. Carmilla found that hard to believe, holding on to the hope that he was not entirely serious about that claim. Yamato explained that enduring countless near-fatal encounters against King Zeros had sharpened his instincts to an extreme level. Through those experiences, he had developed the ability to sense an opponent's presence without relying on ordinary perception. Carmilla tightened her grip on her weapon as she processed that. From her perspective, techniques were meant to prevent death, yet he had learned them by repeatedly standing on the edge of it. To her, that way of thinking defied reason. It made her conclude that logic did not apply to them, that they were all missing something fundamentally human. A trace of unease began to show in her demeanor as she hesitated, questioning his intent. The thought that he might actually kill her crossed her mind, and she tried to assert her standing as a royal of Dorson. In contrast, Yamato made it clear through his calm presence that killing her was not his objective. However, he also admitted that he had never fought with the intention of capturing someone alive. He acknowledged the possibility that he might fail to hold back and accidentally kill her, treating it as something that could be followed by an apology. That response only deepened Carmilla's fear, as the idea of an apology held no meaning in such a situation. In the next moments, the surrounding area was torn apart as the clash intensified. Some time later, King Mars returned from the arena and was met with a scene of heavy destruction. The castle's floors and pillars had been significantly damaged, leaving him visibly surprised as he tried to determine who was responsible. Yamato and Gamera stood present and received him. King Mars directed his attention downward, noticing the captured figure, and sought to identify her. Gamera clarified the situation, identifying the restrained individual as Carmilla, the former princess of the Dorson Kingdom, who currently held the third position among the 5 heavenly ranks. King Mars quietly recalled that he had heard of her before, recognizing her as the infamous figure known as the Mad Princess. Gamera proceeded to explain the situation, stating that Carmilla had arrived claiming she had business with King Mars and had inquired about a scheduled audience. King Mars confirmed that no such meeting had been arranged. Gamera continued his report, stating that Carmilla had entered the castle without permission, engaged in hostile actions with the apparent goal of defeating His Majesty, and sought to stand at the pinnacle of the 100. From what was understood, her intention had been to claim the position of King of Falun. Hearing that, King Mars regarded her not as a visitor but as an assassin. Even so, he considered that simply sending her back to Dorson might be the least troublesome solution. Gamera, however, proposed a different approach, suggesting that she be kept as a hostage. King Mars then turned his attention to what plan Gamera had in mind. At that point, Yamato put forward his own idea. He suggested that Carmilla should undergo training under his guidance. This proposal surprised King Mars. Yamato explained that Carmilla had neglected proper training and had relied too heavily on her natural talent. In his view, that represented a loss not just for her, but for the entire realm, as her potential was being wasted. He continued by stating that if she were to train alongside the 100, her strength would grow significantly. He intended to subject her to a strict regimen under his supervision. The process would begin with her body adapting to monster meat, and once she had adjusted, she would be abandoned deep within the forest of magical beasts, with the expectation that she would find her way back alive. King Mars regarded that proposal as more akin to torture than training. He declined the idea calmly, pointing out that even if Carmilla became stronger, she remained royalty from an opposing nation. He questioned the purpose of strengthening someone who could later become an enemy again. He then looked to Gamera for confirmation, and Gamera agreed with that concern. Instead, Gamera suggested that it would be more beneficial to turn Carmilla into an ally. King Mars considered this perspective, sensing that a more practical plan might be forming. He asked what approach Gamera had in mind. Gamera then proposed a straightforward solution, suggesting that King Mars should marry her. The suggestion left both King Mars and Carmilla visibly stunned.